They shouldn't have given me the key. I knew it before I reached the edge of the village, long before the house came into view with its familiar sloping roof and ivy-choked windows, even before the car pulled away and left me standing on that gravel path with the cold metal biting through my coat pocket, like it wanted to burn its way through. The key was old, blackened in places, heavy for its size. It didn't feel like a key to a house. It felt like a weight or a test. And still, I stepped forward. I told myself it was habit, muscle memory, the body acting without the mind's consent. But the truth is, I think some part of me never left this place, even when they wheeled me into the white-tiled corridors of that clinic in Wales and told me I'd forgotten the difference between trauma and reality. I hadn't forgotten. I just learned that the difference was never as clear as they made it seem. I hadn't seen the house in 17 years. Not since the war. Not since before the desert. Before the letters stopped arriving. Before the dreams took root and wrapped around my spine like vines. And yet there it stood, unchanged, immune to time, or worse, obedient to my memory in a way that made the breath catch in my throat. The same black shutters, slightly crooked on the second floor. The same crack in the leftmost step of the porch. The same wind chime, though the wind wasn't strong enough to move it. As I reached the door, I paused, fingers resting against the smooth brass of the handle. I pulled out the key, fitted it into the lock, turned. It was already open. That should have been my first warning. But warnings mean nothing when you're walking into memory. The door creaked exactly the way I remembered. The scent that hit me was not dust or decay, but wax and coal and something faintly floral, like my mother's perfume, though she'd been dead more than 2 decades. I stepped inside. Everything was in place. I mean that literally. Every piece of furniture, every object was exactly as I remembered it. Not just from childhood, but from the dreams. The green armchair by the fireplace with the tear in the armrest. The ceramic clock on the mantel, its hands forever stopped at 3:15. The tea set on the kitchen table, 3 cups, 1 chipped. Even the patch of sunlight cast on the hallway rug through the stained glass window. Though the sky outside was overcast, I moved through the room slowly. Not out of fear, but something closer to reverence, as though I had stepped into a cathedral of my own mind. I touched the fabric of the curtains in the parlor, ran my hand along the wooden banister, stared too long at a framed photograph on the wall. Me and my brother James, aged 12 and 9, his smile wider than mine, my eyes already distant. He died in 1934, drowned in the lake behind the orchard. That much I knew. But the photo hadn't been on that wall when I left. It had been packed away, or so I thought. The room had remembered where it belonged. Upstairs, the bedrooms waited, silent and full of dust that should have been thicker, considering the time. I opened the door to my old room and nearly turned back. Not because it was wrong, but because it was right. The same bedspread, the same wallpaper, the same crack in the ceiling where I used to imagine faces. Even my books on the shelf, the ones I'd convinced myself I'd sold before enlisting. I touched the spine of one, The Lost World, and it felt warm. Not from the sun, from something else. In the hallway mirror, I looked older than I felt. Not in the skin or the hair, but in the eyes. There was something stretched behind them, like someone who had been awake too long and could no longer tell dream from waking. I stared at myself until the reflection blurred, not from movement, from water. Tears, I realized, were crawling down my face, though I hadn't felt them fall. Night came quickly, as if the house had pulled the sun down on its own terms. I lit candles. Not out of necessity, the electricity worked, though I hadn't flipped a switch, but because the shadows felt more honest than the bulb's hum. I sat in the armchair, let the fire I'd built in the hearth fill the room with breath and crackle. I opened the leather-bound notebook the doctors had given me, the one I was meant to use to anchor myself in reality. I wrote, "Everything is exactly as I remember. That's what frightens me." Somewhere in the walls, I heard something move, not the creak of settling wood, not the skitter of a mouse, but something slow, deliberate, like footsteps without feet. I stood, heart tight, and followed the sound, but it vanished around the corner like a memory retreating before recognition. I opened the door to the study and found it untouched, except for the ashtray on the desk. It was warm. There was no cigarette, but the scent was fresh, my father's brand. He died in that room, slumped over a letter he never finished. I remember finding him. I remember screaming, but the letter on the desk now had no writing, just an envelope, just my name. I didn't open it. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my childhood bed staring at the ceiling, the crack now darker than the rest of the plaster, like a vein stretched across the sky. I counted the seconds between breaths. I imagined James's voice in the next room, my mother humming downstairs, my father coughing behind the study door. I tried to tell myself it was the quiet playing tricks on me, but the truth was simpler. The house hadn't forgotten me, and worse, it had been waiting. I woke to a silence that was not the same silence I had fallen asleep to. It was deeper somehow, thicker, like the air had been pressed into the floor overnight and refused to rise again. For a moment I couldn't move, not out of fear, but confusion. My limbs heavy, my breath uncertain, the bed beneath me slightly colder than it should have been. The window was open. I hadn't left it that way. The curtains moved like they were underwater, slow and strange, brushing the sill as if they were searching for something they'd lost. I sat up and immediately knew something was wrong. The crack in the ceiling had shifted. It wasn't a different crack. It was the same one, but it had moved, or perhaps the bed had. Either way, the angle had changed. It now curved slightly to the right, almost like a crooked smile running across the plaster. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but it didn't revert. If anything, it deepened. I stood and stepped into the hallway. The corridor outside my room felt longer, not wider, not brighter, just longer. I know what memory does. I've spent enough time in a hospital bed reciting events that never happened to know how it frays at the edges, stitches details out of sequence. But this was not memory. This was architecture, measurable, solid. I had walked this corridor as a boy, counting each creaking board between the rooms, tracing my fingertips along the wall's wooden grooves. I remembered the distance between my room and the stairs, but when I walked it now, I passed 2 more doors than I should have. I stopped in front of one I didn't recognize. The handle was old brass, ornate, shaped like a lion's head. I had never seen it before. I turned it, locked. I pressed my ear to the door. Nothing. No sound, no draft, just the weight of something waiting on the other side. I stepped back, looked down the hallway. The light through the stained glass was different. Instead of painting the rug in warm reds and golds, it now cast narrow slashes of blue. I glanced out the window. The sky was clouded, not overcast, unnaturally dull, as though a film had been laid across the glass. I returned to my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and tried to steady myself. The notebook was still there on the nightstand. I opened it. My handwriting stared back at me, yesterday's entry exactly as I'd written it. Beneath it, something new. Same handwriting, same pen, but I hadn't written it. You were never meant to leave this house. I closed the notebook, locked it in the drawer, told myself I must have written it in my sleep. That was easier than believing someone, or something, else had. I left the room and walked downstairs. The house was still quiet, but the kind of quiet that knows you're listening. In the parlor, the furniture hadn't moved, but the light had shifted. The photograph of James and I was missing. The frame remained on the wall, perfectly centered, but it held nothing now except a sheet of faded paper behind cracked glass. I touched the frame, cold. I searched the floor, the nearby shelves, but the photo was gone. In the kitchen, the teacups had changed positions. 2 now sat in front of the chair my mother used to occupy, as if set for company. One was chipped, the other was intact. The air smelled faintly of something warm, clove maybe, or cinnamon, but there was no heat on the stove, no sign that anything had been used. I opened the drawer beneath the sink and found it full of matches, all unused. The box bore a brand I hadn't seen since 1928. I lit a single match and watched the flame bend toward the hallway, as if pulled. I followed. The corridor again, still longer. The doors felt too close now, as if pressing in, narrowing the passage while stretching it at the same time. I opened the one nearest to the stairs. It had once been a linen closet. Now it led into a room I didn't recognize. Square, wood-paneled. A single armchair in the center, a lamp on a side table, and on the table my father's watch. I picked it up. The second hand ticked backward. The time read 3:15. I returned it to the table, stepped out, closed the door, opened it again. The room was gone. Only folded towels and shelves now. I didn't go back upstairs. Not yet. I needed air. I tried the front door. It opened. The world outside was still there, but wrong. The trees were taller. The gate was further from the porch than I remembered. I stepped outside and walked to the gravel path, turned back, counted the windows, 4 on the upper floor. There had always been 3. I re-entered the house, and as I shut the door behind me, the sound echoed far too long, like it had been swallowed by something waiting deeper inside. That night, I sat by the fire again, the notebook open. I forced my hand to write. I documented the door that wasn't there, the room that shifted, the corridor that extended. I didn't mention the photo. I couldn't. The idea of James being erased was worse than any specter. The matchbox sat beside me on the table, the same as before. I struck another. The flame leaned toward the study. I followed again. The portrait above the desk was now different. It had once been of my grandfather. Now it showed a man in uniform, standing beside a door in shadow. I leaned closer. It wasn't a painting. It was a photograph. My breath caught. The uniform was mine. The door behind him was this house. But the man's face wasn't visible, just the suggestion of features, a blur where the eyes should be. I reached out to touch it, but the frame fell from the wall before my fingers connected. The glass shattered. Behind it, nothing, just wall. I cleaned the shards in silence. One caught my palm. The blood was darker than I remembered it being. As I turned to leave the study, I saw a flicker in the mirror near the door. Not my reflection. Something behind me. I turned. Nothing. But the room felt smaller, the hallway longer. And for the first time since I returned, I felt the house was no longer letting me explore. It was showing me, deliberately, as if each new door was being prepared, like a stage, and I had just stepped into the next act. The cold returned on the third morning, not from outside, but from within. The kind of cold that does not freeze the fingers, but coils around the base of the spine and stays there, whispering its intent. I hadn't slept properly, or perhaps I had slept too deeply, for I woke with a heaviness in my limbs that suggested either a dream too large to escape, or a memory I should never have allowed back in. I wrapped myself in the old robe I'd found in the closet, mine, though I don't remember ever packing it when I left the house, and wandered downstairs with the kind of fatigue that makes footsteps feel borrowed. The air in the kitchen was still, as if the whole room were holding its breath, and though I hadn't touched the stove, the scent of burnt toast lingered faintly, the way it used to on school mornings before James left for the lake. I decided I needed heat, something concrete, something mechanical to interrupt the strange elasticity the house had begun to exhibit. The fire was unpredictable, the air thick with something invisible, and I thought that if I could get the radiators working again, I could tether myself back to the physical. I moved through the hallway, still longer than memory allowed, and into the utility room where the central valve had always been. The smell of old metal and oil met me like an old adversary. I crouched, adjusted the knobs, heard the click and hiss of pipes awakening after years of stillness. The familiar groan echoed through the house, rising through the walls, and I followed it from room to room, checking each radiator, placing my hand on the iron to feel the spread of warmth, and that's when I heard it. It came from the radiator in the guest room at the far end of the hall, the one I had not yet entered since returning. The handle resisted, but the door opened with a slow exhale, the hinges complaining in long metallic whines. The room was dim, the curtains drawn, the floor covered in a layer of dust so fine it looked like ash, and on the far wall, under the window, stood the radiator, larger than the others, painted an old, dull green, the kind that matched the walls of the hospital where I'd spent months trying to forget. I knelt beside it, pressed my ear to its side, and at first heard nothing but the usual clinks and rattles of hot water moving through corroded channels. But then the rhythm shifted, the pattern slowed, and between the metallic clicks, I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, it wasn't clear, but it was there. My name, once, twice, then a pause, and then a string of words I recognized not from speech, but from the hours spent on the ward floor, whispering them to the walls when the night was too long and the nurses too far away. I had said those words. I had shaped them in a fever, pressed them into the corners of a mattress, as if they could keep me from vanishing entirely. I couldn't remember what they meant. They had no syntax, but I remembered the rhythm, the intonation, the desperation behind them, and now they were being repeated to me by a machine that should not speak. I stumbled back, fell against the bed. The dust bloomed in the air like smoke, and I choked on it, eyes watering, heart galloping. I waited, back pressed to the floor, until the voice ceased. The radiator returned to silence, the hiss and tick of metal cooling. I stood on shaking legs, opened the notebook I now carried in my robe pocket, and wrote it down. Every word I could remember. I didn't know why, only that not writing it felt like forgetting something vital. I left the guest room, closed the door, did not return that day. In the evening, I sat by the fire again. The house had become still once more, its shifting paused or merely waiting. I read over the notebook entries. My handwriting was unsteady. The earlier passages read like they'd been written by someone else, someone still clinging to the hope that all of this had a rational explanation. I no longer believed that, or perhaps belief wasn't required. This was not about belief. This was about experience. The house was not haunted in the traditional sense. It did not creak with ghosts, or bleed from the walls. It remembered. It remembered me. It remembered everything I had tried to discard. That night, I dreamed of the clinic, the corridor, the one with the tiled floor and flickering lights. But in the dream, the corridor did not end at the ward doors. It opened into the guest room, into the radiator, and beyond it, darkness shaped like a voice. When I woke, the notebook was open beside me, though I had left it locked away. And in my handwriting, though I had not written it, a new phrase: "The house cannot forget what you buried in it." I stared at the words for what felt like hours, and then I underlined them, twice, because I understood something now. The house was not trying to frighten me. It was trying to remind me, and the voice in the radiator was only the beginning. It began with the sound of my own footsteps, muffled by carpet but echoing all the same, the way a dream echoes when you wake up too slowly. I had intended only to fetch my coat. The morning had arrived pale and formless, its light diluted by a sky that refused to decide between rain and stillness. I thought perhaps I might walk the property, see if the garden had survived its abandonment, check the orchard, though I hadn't yet dared to look toward the lake. I had left my coat in the entryway, draped over the banister as I'd done each night since returning. But when I turned the corner from the drawing room into the main corridor, I found the coat missing, and the corridor longer than it had been the day before. Not drastically, no dramatic stretch of hallway or optical trick, but just enough that I stopped walking and frowned, tracing the pattern of the rug with my eyes, realizing the faded medallion in the weave was now followed by two more I had never seen before. I turned back. The doorway I had exited from was closer than it should have been, yet somehow smaller, as if the house were breathing in its walls, stretching and contracting without ever making a sound. I moved forward again, slowly, carefully. I passed the door to the study, then the one to the linen closet, then one that shouldn't have existed, a narrow panel with no knob, just the imprint of hinges, painted over long ago. I pressed my fingers to it. Nothing. Cold wood, unmoving. I continued. Past the frame where the photo of James and I had once hung, past the table with the vase of dead tulips that I had not placed there, until I reached the corner near the staircase. Except the staircase wasn't there. Instead, the corridor turned sharply to the left, where it had never turned before. The wall that had once held the antique barometer was now open space, stretching into another segment of hallway identical to the first. I hesitated, not out of fear, exactly, but a kind of mental fatigue, as though the house were challenging my certainty about its shape and waiting for me to admit defeat. I stepped into the new hallway. It looked the same, exactly the same. Same rug, same wallpaper, cracked at the same seam, same portrait of my grandfather, though it now hung slightly askew. I moved faster, searching for a sign, a door, a window, anything to orient myself. And then, after what could have been 5 minutes or 5 hours, I turned another corner and found myself back where I had started, not in a different place that resembled the entryway. The same one, the exact one. My coat was there, draped over the banister. The lamp I had left on was still humming. The notebook I had placed on the table lay open to the same page, the ink from the night before not yet dry. I touched it, wet. I checked my watch. 15 minutes had passed. I had been walking longer than that. I stood still for a long time, my hand on the railing, trying to measure the beat of my own heart, listening for sounds, pipes, floorboards, whispers from the radiator. But the house had gone quiet again, the kind of quiet that watches you and waits. I tried the front door. It opened, but instead of the gravel path and the hedgerow that marked the beginning of the orchard, there was fog, dense, white, swallowing the world beyond the porch like a curtain drawn over an empty stage. I stepped outside, placed one foot on the top step, then hesitated. The fog did not move. The air had no weight. I took one more step, and then another. The gravel crunched beneath my boots, though it sounded distant, as if muffled by several layers of wool. I walked 5 paces, 10, turned back. The house was still there, but the windows were dark. I could not see inside. I reached for the doorknob again. It opened without resistance, and I stepped through, into the same hallway I had just left, exactly the same. Even the coat had returned to its previous position, though I had not hung it up. This time, I didn't hesitate. I walked the length of the corridor with purpose, counting steps, counting doors, counting breaths. Every time I turned a corner, I returned to the beginning. The loop was perfect, seamless. There were no hidden transitions, no invisible shifts, just the same path, endlessly repeating, folding back into itself like the spiral of a shell. I began to test the boundaries. I opened every door I passed. Sometimes they revealed rooms, sometimes closets, sometimes nothing, just flat walls behind the frame, as if the house hadn't yet decided what should exist there. I marked one of the doors with chalk from the study. The next time I passed it, the mark was gone. I placed a chair in the hallway to block my path. When I returned, the chair had been absorbed into the rug, sunken to half its height, like it had melted into the floor. I tried leaving the front door open, but when I looped back, it was closed again, locked from the inside. I returned to the notebook, wrote everything, every step, every detail, every measurement. I flipped back through the pages, hoping to find something I had missed, something that might hint at a key, a pattern, a flaw in the structure. That's when I found a sketch I didn't remember drawing, a spiral, tight, like a snail's shell, with arrows drawn around it. At the center, a small figure, labeled in my handwriting, me. There were other notes in the margin, scrawled, hastily, fragmented. Every corridor is the same corridor. He walks in the opposite direction. Don't turn around when the light flickers. The sound comes after the shadow. I slammed the notebook shut, sat by the radiator, listened. Nothing. Only heat, for now. But I knew it wouldn't last. The house had shifted again. The corridor was no longer a hallway. It was a loop, and I was no longer walking through it. It was walking me. I had always feared silence more than sound, because silence has a shape if you pay attention to it long enough. It presses against the inside of your skull, tracing your thoughts like fingers through condensation, waiting for one thought in particular to arrive, the one you're not supposed to have, the one that knows the rules of the place you're in better than you do. After the corridor folded into itself for the 5th time, I stopped walking. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, knees up, fingers clenched around the spine of the notebook, and I watched the light bulb above me flicker in erratic spasms, the kind of pulses that made it impossible to tell whether the darkness was moving or I was. I hadn't eaten since the day before, but I didn't feel hunger anymore. The house had begun feeding me something else, something older than food, something that replaced memory with pattern and replaced time with repetition. When I finally rose, I turned around carefully, afraid of triggering another shift in the house's structure, but the corridor remained still, unchanged, except for the air. It had grown warmer, not uniformly, not like heat rising through pipes, but uneven and sickly, a patch of warmth brushing against my cheek like breath. I followed it. I counted each step. I passed the same table with the same broken vase, the same painting that had once shown my grandfather, but now showed only the outline of a figure in uniform with the face missing, a smear of shadow where identity should be. I knew, even then, not to look too long at that image. There are things in this house that reward attention by becoming real. I reached the stairs again. This time they were there, and for once, they did not vanish when I approached. I climbed slowly, one hand on the railing, heart thudding with the quiet panic of progress, as if the house had allowed me a passage only to remind me what should not be passed. On the 2nd floor, the air was different, heavy, perfumed with something bitter and artificial. The corridor here was not looping, or if it was, it hadn't begun yet. The doors were the same, but slightly too tall, slightly too thin. I opened one, my parents' room, untouched. Dust in every fold of the blanket, wardrobe doors ajar, my mother's vanity still bearing the ghosts of bottles, brushes, and powder. But the mirror was gone. In its place stood a window, a perfect square, mounted at eye level, where no window had ever been. Through it I saw only black, not night, not fog, just black, opaque and impenetrable, the way old mirrors turn when left in the dark too long. I reached out, unsure whether to touch it or knock, but before my fingers made contact, it shifted. Not the glass, my reflection. For a breathless second, I saw myself as I was. Then I blinked, and the man staring back wasn't blinking with me. His face was mine, but leaner, sharper, the skin around the eyes darker and sunken, The uniform he wore, not the robe I had on, but my old service jacket, pressed and clean, as if freshly issued. He raised one hand. I did not. I froze. He smiled. A slow, deliberate curve of the lips. My mouth remained still. He mouthed something. I didn't understand, but I knew what he meant. I backed away. The figure didn't follow, but the smile remained. I closed the door. The hallway had darkened. The other doors now looked closed too tightly, as though the house had pulled them inward to hide something or protect it. I stepped into the bathroom, needing water. Something cool, something real. The mirror above the sink was cracked across its center. Not shattered, cracked precisely. A perfect line running horizontally from one edge to the other. I stared into it and saw myself again. No trick, no figure, no blink. But then the crack began to widen. Not rapidly, not violently, just slowly, like a mouth opening without sound. I turned off the light, left the room. Back in my bedroom, the window was open. The curtains didn't move. The air was dead. But the mirror on the wardrobe, which I had always avoided since returning, now reflected something it should not have. It showed the hallway behind me, but not as it was. In the mirror, the corridor was lit by dozens of wall sconces, golden and flickering, and the rug was clean, the walls uncracked. The house, as it once was, alive. I turned around. The real hallway remained dark, broken, lined with dust. I looked back at the mirror. The reflection changed. I was gone from it. The hallway was empty. Then a shape appeared at the end, not moving, standing, facing away. I shut the wardrobe, sat on the edge of the bed, tried to breathe, tried to remember which version was true. I wrote in the notebook, described each mirror, each detail, but the ink ran in one paragraph, soaked the page as if the words had bled out of me. And in the margin, something appeared in my handwriting, though I had not written it. When the mirror blinks first, it means you're already inside. I closed the book, went to the window, looked down at the yard, but there was no yard, only corridor, endless, curved, leading back to the mirror, and in its surface, just before I turned away, I saw myself again, blinking, but not in time with me. There's a kind of silence that doesn't belong to a room, but to memory itself, the type that stretches across the years like dust on the surface of a forgotten table, thin enough to see through, but heavy enough to choke you if stirred too suddenly. I opened the door to the guest room late in the afternoon, not because I had a reason, but because the house had grown too quiet, too still, and I felt it watching me from the inside out. The corridor behind me had stopped shifting, or at least had paused long enough for me to mistake it for stability, but I no longer trusted stillness. In this house, stillness was never peace. It was calculation. The door opened without resistance. The scent hit me first. Mothballs, dried wood, and something else beneath it. Something that smelled like parchment, burned just enough to smoke but not to ignite. The room was larger than I remembered, or maybe my memory had shrunk it to something more manageable over the years. The window was shuttered, the light barely filtering through the cracks, but what it touched glowed faintly, as if the dust itself carried memory in its particles. I stepped inside slowly, letting my boots creak against the floorboards that hadn't felt a human step in over a decade. And yet, nothing looked abandoned. On the bed were clothes, not folded, arranged, a uniform, mine, not a replica or something pulled from an old trunk, but the exact one I had worn in 1943 during the Ardennes, right down to the frayed hem on the left sleeve and the blood-stained collar no amount of washing had ever truly removed. I approached it with caution, the way you approach the memory of a wound that has stopped bleeding but still aches when it rains. I reached out and touched the fabric. It was warm, not sun-warm, body-warm, as if someone had worn it only moments before and laid it there in my absence. Beside it on the nightstand sat my journal, the one I lost in the field hospital. I opened it. The pages were intact, my handwriting, my sketches. The last entry, exactly where I remembered stopping. Mid-sentence, interrupted by the shelling that tore through the roof of the infirmary. But there were more pages now, filled with words I didn't remember writing. The same handwriting, same ink, but thoughts I had not had. Observations of the house, of this room, of the mirrors, of the voice in the radiator, and then notes about her, my wife. Her name, written in cursive again and again, sometimes paired with dates, sometimes with fragments of conversation I couldn't place. I hadn't spoken her name aloud since the funeral. I closed the book. My hands were shaking. On the chair in the corner of the room lay a scarf. Red. I recognized it instantly. It had belonged to her. I had given it to her the day before I left for deployment. She had worn it every winter. After her death, I had kept it in a drawer, wrapped in tissue. I had never brought it to this house. I never intended to. And yet here it was, draped with care, as if placed by someone who knew how important it was, how cruel it could be to find it like this. There was a second bed in the room, identical frame, same quilt, freshly made. The indentation on the pillow suggested someone had lain there recently. My breath caught. The air shifted. A draft passed behind me, though no window was open. I turned. The mirror above the dresser reflected both beds. Only one was empty. I wrote in the notebook that night with a kind of desperation I hadn't felt since the days in the ward, the kind that comes not from confusion but from recognition. The house wasn't haunting me. It was remembering me. Or worse, it was reminding me of things I had tried to forget, not because they were painful, but because they were impossible. I remembered the corridor, the loops, the voice, the mirror that didn't blink with me, and now the guest room, set not for a stranger, but for two people who should no longer exist in the same space. The air grew cold. I lit a candle, sat on the edge of the second bed. I could still smell her perfume, faint but unmistakable. I closed my eyes, and for one moment, I heard the soft sound of someone exhaling beside me, not breathing, exhaling, as if they had just spoken without making a sound. The attic had always been the part of the house I avoided, not out of fear, but out of something closer to guilt. It was where my father kept the boxes no one else was allowed to open, where old photographs lay curled by heat and time, where the smell of paper and mold formed a wall thicker than wood. As a boy, I had crept up there only once, and seen a portrait of my mother hidden beneath a blanket, her face younger than I ever remembered her, smiling in a way she never did when she was alive. That memory had stayed buried, and for years I told myself there was no reason to go back up, that nothing of value could be found in a place that had already been surrendered to dust and shadow. But on the seventh night in the house, I woke from a dream of footsteps on the ceiling, deliberate and unhurried, as if someone were pacing above my room with the patience of memory itself. The sound didn't stop. It circled, retraced, paused, and when I finally rose and opened the door, the attic hatch was already ajar. The ladder extended itself without a sound. The air that greeted me was thick, warmer than the rest of the house, laced with the scent of old linen and candle wax. I climbed slowly, half expecting the hatch to close behind me, but it stayed open, as if the house wanted me to see what it had been keeping. The attic was darker than I remembered, the windows too dusty to admit more than the faintest outline of moonlight, but I could still make out the shapes of things long buried. Trunks, boxes, furniture under sheets, and in the far corner, a small writing desk with its drawer pulled halfway open. I made my way toward it, my boots disturbing the dust like snowfall, the floorboards groaning with each step. When I reached the desk, I found the drawer filled with envelopes, dozens of them, maybe more. I lifted one. My name was on the front, written in my own hand. I opened it. Inside was a letter, written in ink, the strokes familiar. It was dated February 1945. The handwriting was mine, the language mine, but the contents were not. It spoke of dreams, of guilt, of a woman left behind. It ended with the phrase, "I'll be back in time for the corridor." I opened another, different date, March 1945, same ending. I read letter after letter, unable to stop, each one more personal than the last, detailing memories I did not recall writing, feelings I had never fully admitted, not even to myself. They were addressed to her, my wife, and yet none had ever been sent, none had been sealed. They were folded gently, as if preserved for something, or someone, but not the mail. One letter spoke of the war ending, of my return, of the fear that the man who came back would not fit the life he had left. Another described the house in detail, the layout, the shadows, the mirrors, and included a warning in the margins. If the doors do not stay where you left them, leave immediately. If they begin to return to their original positions, you're almost out. Almost out, not safe, not done. The phrase haunted me as I read on. I began to notice changes in the letters. They shifted over time. The tone grew darker, more fragmented. By July 1945, the handwriting faltered. The sentences turned cryptic, circular, as if written in the middle of a dream, or dictated by something that only spoke through symbols. And still, each one ended with the same sentence. I'll be back in time for the corridor. I found a stack bound by twine at the very bottom of the drawer. These were older, dated before the war. 1938, 1939. They were addressed to no one. Some were addressed to myself. Some simply began with "to the one still listening." These letters spoke of a door in the house that appeared only when forgotten, a window that opened only at night, a hallway that grew with regret. They described the house not as a place, but as a reflection, a shape carved out of everything I refused to say aloud. And in one of them, the last of the bundle, a phrase repeated 3 times: "Do not follow the man with no face. He will not stop walking. He walks in time. He is the house remembering itself." I sat on the attic floor for hours. The letters spread around me like fallen leaves, my fingers numb from touching so many versions of myself. I no longer knew which ones I had written, which ones had been imagined, or which ones had written me. I packed them into a box, carried them downstairs, placed them on the table beside the notebook. I didn't dare reread them that night. The hallway had changed again. It had grown wider. The rugs had been replaced by wood. The paintings were gone. The sconces burned low, even though I hadn't lit them. I walked the length once and returned to the same place as before, but the shadows had deepened. I looked at the mirror by the stairs and saw something I had not seen before. A letter, held by a man, facing away. I didn't see him at first, not truly, though I suspect he had been there longer than I knew, standing just beyond where the corridor curved slightly out of sight, his form perfectly still, framed by the house's deliberate architecture, in the same way a portrait is framed not by choice, but by inevitability. I was on my way to the kitchen, or at least I thought I was, following the same pattern I had followed since my arrival, a series of turns and retraced steps that had once belonged to routine but now felt like ritual, necessary only because the house demanded it. I passed the mirror near the stairwell, the one that had refused to reflect me accurately for days, and in its depth I caught the outline, tall, narrow, facing away, clothed in something that didn't quite absorb the light, but refused to give it back. I stopped walking, turned toward the hallway. Nothing. Just length, just silence. But when I looked back at the mirror, he was still there, unmoved. It wasn't until later that I realized he had always faced the direction I was walking, that I was always moving toward him, and never away, no matter which direction I thought I turned. The house was curving, subtly, invisibly, not in loops now, but in spirals, and every path I took, every decision to explore or retreat, led me back to him. The first time I saw him with my own eyes, not through glass or reflection, but through air, was after I woke from a dream I don't remember entering. I was in the guest room again. The journal opened beside me, all the letters gone, vanished from the box. The closet door was open. I hadn't touched it. Inside, only a chair, a single chair, and on it, a uniform not mine, draped precisely, the buttons polished, the insignia worn. I stepped toward it, drawn not by curiosity, but by recognition. Before I reached it, I saw him in the hallway again, closer this time, just beyond the frame of the door, always facing away, still, waiting. I called out, not loudly, just enough to prove I had a voice. No answer. He didn't move. But the candle on the dresser flickered hard to one side, as if exhaling, and when I blinked, the figure had shifted, only slightly, his shoulders raised as if drawing breath. I backed away, shut the door, not out of fear, but the understanding that something had changed. He was no longer an echo in glass or the artifact of a dream. He was present. Later that day, I found the photograph again, the one of my grandfather in uniform, except it wasn't him anymore. It was the man from the corridor. His face was turned now, only slightly visible in profile. But what struck me most was not his resemblance to anyone I knew, but how utterly faceless he remained. Not blank, but distorted, as though the house had tried to remember what a man looked like and failed at the last moment. That night, the lights began to fail, one by one. Always when I approached the end of a hallway, always when I neared a door I hadn't opened before. It became a pattern I couldn't unsee. Progress leading to darkness, retreat leading to illumination. I began to test it. I moved forward slowly, candle in hand, and sure enough, the moment I reached the threshold near the east wing, the flame went out. Not by wind, not by breath, simply gone, swallowed by the space that did not want it. I relit it, took a step back. The flame returned. This happened again and again, until the final night of the week. when I saw him not at a distance, not in a mirror, but in the hallway 3 feet from where I stood. He was taller than I expected, not by height but by presence, his shape unfamiliar, and yet entirely correct, the way a nightmare feels both alien and intimate. He did not move. His back remained toward me, his head tilted slightly as if listening. I didn't speak. I didn't breathe. I waited, and then the light above me flickered once, twice, and died. In the dark, I heard a sound, not a voice, not footsteps, a breath, sharp and drawn, held in the lungs of something that no longer needed air, and then a whisper, not from the man, but from behind me. He walks in time. He waits when you turn. I spun. No one. The hallway was empty again. The lights returned. He was gone, but the air still held his shape. A void pressed into the space where he had stood, like heat lingering after a body departs. I collapsed into the nearest chair, the notebook pressed against my chest, and wrote what I could remember. In the morning, the guest room was empty again, the closet bare, the uniform gone, but the mirror, the one above the fireplace in the drawing room, now showed only the hallway, always the hallway, and always, at the far end, him, closer. The thing about rooms is that we assume they are closed because we see their walls. But I had started to notice that the walls in this house didn't always end where they should, that some corners turned without ever being built, that the silence behind certain doors rang a little too deeply to be just wood and air. It began with the mirror again, the same one over the fireplace, which had become more of a window than a reflection. That morning I stared into it for too long. I had awoken from a sleep I couldn't remember entering, with my mouth dry and my tongue heavy, and I found myself standing in the drawing room still dressed in yesterday's clothes, the journal pressed between my fingers with no recollection of writing in it. When I finally looked up, the mirror no longer showed me. It showed the hallway as always, but this time it was different. It was brighter, sharper, and in the far end of it, not the man, no, something else. A door, one I had never seen. I turned to look behind me. No door. I turned back to the mirror. Still there. I knew where it was. Not because of logic, but because the house wanted me to. The mirror had been guiding me for days, perhaps longer. I returned to the corridor, past the stairwell, the sconce that flickered when you came too close, the painting that no longer bore a face. I reached the far end and counted the panels on the wall. 7. Then I stopped. I placed my hand on the 7th. Pushed. Nothing. I knocked. Hollow. And then, without hesitation, I slid the painting from the adjacent wall aside. Behind it, a narrow seam in the wallpaper, a fracture. I pressed again. This time the wall gave way. Behind the panel was a door, small, fitted not for passage but for secrecy. I opened it. The scent was immediate. Not rot, not decay, but antiseptic, the kind that stains the memory of anyone who's ever spent too much time in institutions. The air was sterile, unnatural, too clean for a place so forgotten. I stepped through and found myself in a hallway I didn't recognize. The floor was linoleum, the walls pale green. A single overhead light buzzed above. I walked slowly, my boots echoing unnaturally on the floor, the sound bouncing in rhythms I couldn't trust. I passed a window. It was black on the other side, not from darkness, but because there was no world beyond it. The hallway bent left. I followed. At the end was a room. I opened the door. Fluorescent lights flickered on overhead. I saw a bed, a metal-framed cot. Beside it, a cabinet. A clipboard hung from it. I stepped closer and froze. My name, full, last name underlined. Date of admittance, September 18th, 1938. But that was before the war, before everything. I wasn't admitted then, was I? I reached for the file, opened it. Inside, pages of observations, drawings, dream records. Each page written in the same clinical tone I had become familiar with at the hospital in Wales. But none of these matched their archives. These were older, faded, as if they'd been sitting here, in this room, waiting. I flipped to the last page. A return to the primary structure has been confirmed. Subject responds to corridors, but not time. Spatial memory overlaps with fabricated environments. He refers to the mirror as a portal. Subject draws the man repeatedly, though denies knowledge of him. Claims to hear voices in pipes. Believes house is a reflection. Recommends observation through controlled re-entry. My chest tightened. The walls felt closer now. Not physically, but perceptually, like a lens tightening around my breath. I looked back at the bed. There was an impression in the pillow, fresh, and on the floor, the outline of boots facing away from the bed. pressed into the dustless tile. I turned, left the room, ran back down the hall, through the door, through the panel, back into the house. But the air had changed. It was warmer, still, expectant. I staggered into the drawing room and looked into the mirror again. No reflection, no hallway, just black. Then, slowly, the image returned. My face, and behind me, the man, no longer still, now walking toward me. The house no longer needed to pretend. Whatever fragile boundary it once respected between what I believed and what it had always known had dissolved sometime in the night. Or perhaps there had never been a night at all. Just an unbroken stretch of moment pulling itself tighter around my awareness, like a hallway that grew narrower the more I walked it. I woke on the floor of the drawing room, my journal torn in half beside me, the ink soaked through the wood, as if the pages had tried to bury themselves in the grain. The mirror was gone, not shattered, not removed. Gone. In its place was the wall, seamless, smooth, as if it had never held anything at all. The man was no longer in the mirror because he was no longer elsewhere. He was here, not standing, not walking, but present. Every reflection had stopped showing me. Every corner of the house now curved, even when it didn't. Every room whispered back my breath a half-second too late, as if the space around me was no longer reacting to me, but rehearsing me. The front door didn't exist anymore. I tried to reach it. I followed the steps I had written, the careful paths I had recorded, but where there should have been hinges and a knob, there was only wall, painted and clean, bearing no trace of ever having been anything else. I laughed, I think, or screamed, or both. The sound never reached me. It died before leaving my lips, swallowed by the thing the house had become, or always was. I understood now. The man was not someone I would meet. He was someone I had been, or would become. The letters said it. The journal implied it. The hospital files confirmed it. Subject walks in time. Corridor expands with memory. Do not engage once recognition begins. But it was too late for that. The corridor had already looped, not through the house, through me. The more I tried to leave, the deeper I went. The tighter the curve of each hallway became, folding around decisions I had made years ago, conversations I had buried, guilt I had pretended to survive. And at the center of that spiral was not an exit. It was a mirror, the final mirror, small, cracked, nailed to the door of the guest room. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was the only thing left that still recognized me. I stared into it. Not long, just enough. I saw the man. He was me, but older, not in body, in posture. His shoulders carried the shape of rooms, the bend of hallways, the tilt of memory, and when he turned, I expected to see my face, fractured perhaps, blurred as always. But it wasn't. It was whole and smiling. Not with malice, with understanding. He reached into his coat, pulled out the notebook, my notebook. He opened it, wrote something, turned the page to the mirror, held it up, and I saw the words. You never left. You walked too far inside. The mirror blinked, and in that instant, everything vanished. No walls, no ceiling, no doors, just corridor. Endless, curved, no beginning, no end. Not the house, not the war. Not the woman I lost or the brother I buried, only the corridor, and me, or the shape I had left behind, the body that kept walking, because that's what corridors do when no one closes them. They walk you, until you forget you ever needed to stop. Historia 2. I told myself I wouldn't come back. Not here. Not to this stretch of nameless forest choked by fog and memory. Not to the place where time folded inward and refused to move forward the way the rest of the world had after the war ended. But here I was again, boots pressing into the same wet earth that had swallowed my men one by one without sound or struggle. The same trees standing tall and still as if waiting for something to return that never would, or maybe already had. The Jeep I borrowed was parked 2 kilometers back, abandoned at the old fence line where the dirt road ended and the path of silence began. I could have turned around at any moment, told myself the mud was too thick, the trail too faded, but I didn't. Because the truth was that something had pulled me back. Not duty, not guilt, not even grief, but something older. Something that reached into my ribs and whispered just loud enough for me to follow. The air was colder than I remembered, damp in a way that seemed to press through my clothes and settle in my bones. The trees hadn't changed, still tall and skeletal, bare at the base and tangled at the top. Their limbs draped in ghost-gray moss that hung like the remnants of uniforms, left to rot in the rain. I kept walking, counting the distance in breaths, not in steps. And with each breath I thought I heard something just beyond it. Not quite a voice, not quite wind, but something in between. I tried to tell myself it was just the forest reclaiming space after the fire of war, that nature didn't forget but chose not to remember the way men did. But even then, I knew I was lying to myself. The first time I heard my name, I stopped moving completely. Not because it surprised me, but because I had been expecting it. The sound came from my left, not loud, not shouted, but spoken with a softness that made it worse, like someone was close, like someone knew exactly where I was, and didn't need to raise their voice to be heard. I turned slowly, hand, drifting to the place where my sidearm used to be before I left it behind with the rest of the gear I no longer had reason to carry. There was nothing there, just trees and fog and a pile of leaves too perfectly still. I waited for movement, for the snap of a twig or the rustle of fabric, but nothing came. And that silence was the most familiar sound of all. I pressed on, deeper now, toward the place we had set camp nearly 2 years ago. The memory of it lived in the landscape. There, the ridge, where Dawson had slipped in the rain. There, the hollowed-out trunk where Telford stashed the whiskey we never drank. And there, just beyond the bend, the clearing where I last saw their faces before they vanished into that impossible night. I stopped just short of it, heart hammering harder now. Not from exertion, but from something else entirely. Something between dread and hope. Something I didn't have a name for anymore. When I finally stepped into the clearing, the wind died. It didn't fade. It stopped completely. The grass had grown taller, wild and untamed, but I could still see the shape of where the tents had been. The dark outlines where fire pits had cooled. The drag marks of something moved or taken or simply dissolved into the soil. I crouched and ran my hand across the ground, feeling for anything solid beneath the surface, anything that might connect the now to the then, and that's when I felt it again. My name, closer this time, no longer a whisper, no longer a suggestion, but a voice I recognized, speaking the syllables like they mattered, like they belonged to someone still living. Michael. I froze, every part of me braced for what came next, but again, nothing followed, just that one word, not spoken again, not echoed, just dropped into the air like a stone into still water. I turned in a slow circle, eyes scanning the tree line. The fog had thickened around the edges of the clearing, a slow, deliberate crawl inward, as if the forest itself was closing its mouth. Around me, I backed up a step, not in fear, not yet, but in readiness, in instinct, the way soldiers do when the air changes and the wind carries something it shouldn't. I called out then, not with hope, but with demand. I said the names of the men who had gone missing that night, one by one, each name like a test, like a flare shot into a black sky. Dawson, Mathers, Telford, Kaplan. I repeated them all, including the two whose faces I couldn't remember anymore, but whose boots I had tied when they were too cold to move. There was no answer, just that slow fog and the steady beat of my own breathing. I camped at the edge of the clearing that night, not in the exact spot where our tents had once stood, but close enough to remember and far enough to pretend I didn't. I didn't light a fire, couldn't bring myself to. Not here, not yet. Instead, I sat with my back to a tree and listened, not just to the forest, but to what it remembered. The sounds were wrong, not just quiet, but void. No insects, no rustle of underbrush, no distant owl calls or cracking branches, only breath and fog, and the soft hiss of air that moved like someone exhaling behind my ear. I thought about the last night I saw them, but I didn't let myself remember everything. Not yet. That was for later. That was for when I knew the trees were ready to listen again, because they had watched it all happen. I was sure of that now. And trees don't forget. They just wait until you're quiet enough to hear what they've been holding all along. Before I slept, I said my name aloud, just once, just to reclaim it. And from somewhere in the trees, I heard it said back to me. I woke before the sun rose. Or maybe it never rose at all. Maybe it simply gave up trying to pierce the weight of the fog that had settled over the clearing like a second skin, thick and unmoving. A blanket stretched so low to the earth that even the breath from my mouth seemed swallowed before it could float away. I sat up slowly, every joint, stiff from the cold and from the way memory hardens inside you when you sleep on ground that remembers more than you do. The tree behind me was wet with dew that hadn't come from rain. and the leaves above hung still, as if caught in a moment too sacred to disturb. I stayed quiet for a long time, not because I was afraid to move, but because I knew better now. The forest didn't reward noise. Not here, not anymore, and certainly not from me. I watched the fog breathe across the old fire pit. The stones still there, half covered in moss, blackened by a fire that never quite gave us heat. I hadn't built a flame the night before, and I wouldn't today either. There was something about this place that didn't want light. Something in the way the trees loomed like ribs around a hollow chest. Something in the way the fog moved with a purpose I couldn't explain. I stood slowly, brushed the dirt from my coat, and walked to the center of the clearing, the same spot where the tent poles had once been. Driven into frozen ground, I could still see them in my mind. Kaplan cursing at the knots, Dawson laughing as the canvas whipped in the wind, Telford always adjusting, always aligning, always trying to make the corners square, even though nothing about that forest was ever straight. I turned a slow circle and found the place where we had positioned the radio tent, slightly downhill so the signal could catch something from the south. It hadn't helped. That's where I sat again, knees in the damp. Moss, hands brushing away a layer of time. I didn't expect to find the radio. It was gone. Of course it was gone. Taken or rotted or devoured by whatever hunger lives in dirt that drinks blood. But I could still feel it, as if the weight of its silence lingered, as if the crackle of static had etched itself into the roots. We'd been receiving reports fine until the final night, until the moment when we needed it, when I tried to call in the coordinates for a resupply and the only response was a sharp click, then another, then silence so deep it rang. I remember tapping the side of the metal, adjusting the dial, adjusting again, calling out in that half-command voice they train into you, expecting someone on the other end to say copy that. Sergeant Rennick, coming through clear, but no one did. Not then, not after, not ever. I remember Mathers sitting beside me, chewing the inside of his cheek like he always did when he was nervous, and I remember the way his eyes darted toward the trees, not with fear, but with something closer to recognition, as if he'd just remembered something he'd been trying not to. I stayed near the old radio site for most of the day, didn't speak, didn't move far, just waited. I wanted the fog to lift, but it didn't. It only grew heavier as the light changed, not darker, just thicker, the way smoke fills a room but leaves no heat. It made the trees look like shadows of themselves, and every time I turned my head, I thought I saw movement just past, the edge of vision, a coat sleeve flicking behind bark, a boot vanishing into brush. Once I even thought I saw Dawson's cap on the stump where he used to sit and write letters he never mailed. There were no birds, not even crows, no insects humming in the grass, no mice rustling through the roots. Even the flies that should have hovered over Old Death were absent, as if the air itself refused to carry decay, as if time had held its breath and nothing had dared to fill the space it left behind. Remember thinking that this was the only place I had ever known where rot did not stink, where death did not demand attention, and that scared me more than blood ever had. I walked the perimeter by instinct, tracing where the tents had been, trying to feel the impressions left behind, not just in the ground, but in the air, the weight of presence still lingering like the smell of a cigarette in a jacket long since put away. I passed the place where we kept the crates, now just a dip in the soil, past the tree where we hung lanterns, now a bare limb with a deep notch carved like a warning, and finally, I stood where I had last seen them together, the 5 of them, laughing too loudly for a place that hated noise. That was the night before they vanished, the night before the fog came for real and never left, the night before the fire went cold without burning down. I sat again, knees aching, and placed my palms flat on the ground where the radio used to sit, not searching. This time, just remembering, and for a moment, only a moment, I thought I felt heat, not warmth, not from within, but the echo of heat, the memory of something burning just beneath the dirt. But there was no smoke, no smell of ash, only silence and fog that refused to lift, as if the forest had chosen what it wanted to keep, and I wasn't sure yet if it meant to give anything back. It took me hours to build the fire, not because I lacked the skill. I had built hundreds before this one, in mud, in snow, in bomb craters, under trees shattered by artillery, but this one resisted in ways I couldn't name. The branches I gathered were dry to the touch, but somehow heavy, not with water, but with something else, something old and reluctant, the kind of weight that doesn't come from moisture, but from memory. I arranged them the way we used to, forming a star, feeding kindling into the center like we had done the first night we made camp in this exact clearing, back when the fog had still been just fog, and the silence hadn't learned how to speak. The match flared easily enough, the flame taking to the paper with a hunger I didn't trust. It licked the dry bark, curled into the creases of the wood, and for a moment I thought maybe it would hold. Maybe I would feel heat again. Maybe the cold lodged in my spine would finally break apart and run from me like it used to when the fire found its breath. But the flame flickered, danced, and then hesitated, as if unsure of itself. It bent to one side, pulled by some current I couldn't feel, then collapsed in on itself, not extinguished, not suffocated, just gone, like it had chosen not to exist anymore. I stared at the blackened paper, the unburned logs, the coals that never became coals, and I felt something I hadn't felt since that last night. Helplessness, not in the way a soldier fears death, but in the way a man fears being forgotten, being erased. I remembered how cold it had been that night, how Telford kept feeding wood into the fire, while Kaplan rubbed his hands and muttered about how the smoke smelled wrong. I remember looking at the flames and realizing I couldn't feel their warmth on my face, even though I sat no more than an arm's length away. I remember thinking it was strange, and saying nothing because strange things didn't belong in reports, only in memories, only in dreams. We had sat around that fire for hours, saying nothing useful, not talking about home or God or women, just passing the time the way soldiers do when they've run out of things to believe in. I had a deck of cards, but no one wanted to play. Mathers had a harmonica he didn't touch, and Dawson had a bottle of something clear and sharp that no one opened. The fog had already begun to gather around us by then, crawling across the clearing like a blanket pulled too tightly. We didn't notice at first. Or maybe we did, but pretended we didn't, because noticing meant admitting something was wrong, and soldiers aren't trained to notice the wrong things, only to wait until they become orders. I remember the moment it started, not the vanishing, not yet, but the shift, the moment when the sound changed, when the forest exhaled all at once and didn't inhale again. The fire didn't flicker, but the light around us dimmed as if a cloud had passed overhead. Only there were no stars visible and no moon to hide, just gray and more gray, and the feeling that something large had turned its gaze toward us. I remember looking at Telford and seeing that he was already standing, already holding his rifle with both hands, already staring past the fire into the dark between the trees where nothing moved, but everything waited. Then came the sound, not loud, not close, but deep, like something groaning in its sleep, like a hill rolling over in its grave. It came from the north, from beyond the old radio tent, and we all turned in unison, not from fear, but from instinct, like dogs sensing a storm before it breaks. And then, as quickly as it came, the sound stopped, and something else filled the space. A click, soft, sharp, not metal, not bone, just real. And then another, and then silence again, this time deeper, so thick it felt like it pressed against our skin, like we had to push through it just to breathe. I gave the order to stay close, to form a perimeter, to keep eyes on each other, and they followed, because they always followed. Even when I didn't know what I was doing, we circled the fire, rifles low, steps measured, not saying a word, just moving like we had trained. But none of our training had prepared us for this, for fog that refused to scatter, for shadows that didn't cast, for a fire that gave no heat and still held our gaze like a lighthouse warning ships away from a shore that no longer existed. That's when Dawson disappeared. 1 second he was there, standing just past the fire pit, his silhouette clear against the gray, and the next he was gone, not pulled, not dragged, just gone, like someone had reached in and plucked him out of the picture. Kaplan shouted, lunged toward where Dawson had been, and I grabbed his shoulder, pulled him back, shouted something. His name, a command. I don't remember, but by then, the fog had thickened again, and Telford was already gone too, and the fire was dying in the way things die when they're no longer believed in. We regrouped as best we could, backs together, eyes wide, breaths shallow. Mathers crying now, silently, and Kaplan holding the empty bottle, like a weapon, the harmonica still in his pocket. And I remember thinking that if I reached into the fire, I wouldn't feel anything. Just cold air and ash, just the shape of a warmth that never was. That was the last night I saw any of them whole, The last night before I woke to an empty camp, before the fog became a voice, before my name returned to me like an accusation. And now, here, trying again to light that same fire, watching it die in the exact same way, I realized what I had refused to understand back then. The fire was never meant to warm us. It was meant to keep something else away. And when it failed, whatever waited in the trees finally stepped forward. I hadn't spoken aloud in 2 days, not because I was preserving energy or discipline, not even because I feared who or what might hear me, but because the silence felt like a pact I wasn't allowed to break, a truce between me and this place, between memory and the dirt it sleeps under. Every sound I did make, from the creak of my boots to the rustle of canvas, to the snap of a twig beneath my heel, felt like a question. This forest didn't want answered. I moved slowly through the undergrowth, tracing the old patrol route as best I could, though the trees had shifted, as they always seem to in places that keep secrets. I didn't expect to find anything useful, maybe a rusted canteen or the glint of glass from a broken field bottle. But I kept going because something told me I had missed something. Not back then, not during. The fog and the screaming and the disappearance, but after, something I had walked past without realizing, and now, for reasons I couldn't articulate, it was ready to be seen. It happened near the dry creek bed just east of the clearing, the place where Telford used to piss in the dark so no one would see him fumbling with his belt. He had this superstition that relieving yourself too close to camp would invite something in, not an animal, something worse. I had laughed at him for that, once I noticed the tree first, a broad stump covered in moss, angled just slightly wrong, not natural, not fallen by storm or rot. Something had pushed it over years ago, and the forest had simply accepted it, growing around the ruin like a scar. I circled it once and something caught my eye. A corner of fabric, barely visible, trapped between the trunk and the soft earth beneath. I dropped to my knees, brushed the moss aside, and pulled slowly, carefully, afraid not of what I might find, but of what it might mean if I did. The cloth came loose with a wet rip, a small bundle wrapped in oilskin, tied with cord that had long since softened and split. I didn't open it right away. I just stared, heart thudding in a way I hadn't felt since the night they vanished. Not fear, not quite, but recognition. My hands worked without thinking, peeling back layers of decay until the contents spilled onto the grass. Dog tags, one bootlace, a folded photograph, and Telford's field knife, the same one he used to cut jerky into strips and clean his fingernails with during idle hours. The blade rusted now, but the initials still there, E.T., scratched crookedly into the handle like a boy trying to prove he existed. The photo was of his sister, or maybe his wife, I couldn't remember anymore. All I knew was that he kept it in his breast pocket and never let anyone else touch it, and now it lay here, buried like evidence. Not dropped, not lost, deliberately hidden, as if he knew he wouldn't need it again, or as if someone had taken it from his chest and decided it no longer mattered. I sat back on my heels and stared at the collection, trying to breathe around the pressure building behind my eyes, because these were not the remains of a man dragged into the woods by force. They were offerings, placed gently, deliberately, like someone wanted to say goodbye but couldn't risk doing it where we might see. I gathered everything and wrapped it back in the oilskin, tied it with the old cord, and slipped it into my pack. The knife I kept in my hand, not for defense, but because it still felt like his, like maybe holding it would bring his voice back. I tried to imagine Telford's last moments, whether he had run like the others or stayed put, whether he had followed my order or made his own decision, whether he had screamed my name and I never heard it, or simply gone quiet like the fire, like the fog. Like everything else, I went back to the clearing and stood where his tent had been, tried to picture him kneeling by the fire, adjusting the logs with that same knife, joking about how the only thing worse than rations was Kaplan's attempt at stew. I could almost see it, hear it, until I realized the fog had returned again, thicker this time, pressing close around the trees like hands pulling a curtain shut. I turned slowly, scanning the edges of the clearing, and that's when I realized how far the silence went. Not just soundless, but lifeless. Not a breeze, not a bird, not even the buzz of a fly against my ear. I looked down at the knife, at the rust, and the edge dulled by years underground, and I whispered his name, not because I thought it would bring him back, but because saying it out loud felt like the least I owed him. Telford, I said again, and the sound of it felt wrong in my mouth, like something sacred I hadn't earned the right to speak. I stayed by the fire pit that night, or what was left of it. I didn't try to light another flame. I just sat with the knife across my lap, the bundle of belongings at my feet, and I waited, not for rescue, not for revelation, but for understanding. I was no longer a soldier here, no longer a sergeant, not without them, not with only echoes in my memory and soil beneath my nails. I was just a man in a place that remembered too much. And as I drifted into sleep, I thought I heard his voice again, not speaking, not calling, just breathing, just close. And I felt the knife shift slightly in my hand, warm for just a second, as if he had placed it there himself. The fog didn't lift that night, not even for a moment. It hung against the earth-like breath frozen in mid-air, thick enough that I couldn't see the trees at the edge of the clearing, thick enough that I began to wonder if I had imagined the forest altogether, as if I were no longer in a place, but inside a memory, stretched and warped, where time had slowed to the rhythm of my own fear. I lay on my side in the tent, eyes open, staring at the canvas like it might dissolve, like I might wake up again in a barracks or a hospital, or a trench anywhere but here. But I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Not with the fog pressing so close. Not with the silence holding its breath. The knife Telford had once owned lay beside me, its handle cold against the dirt, and I kept one hand resting near it the way I used to rest near my sidearm during night patrols. Not out of paranoia, but because my body had learned to do it without asking. I hadn't used a blade in years. Not for anything more than cutting rope or scraping old labels off crates, but the weight of it now felt necessary, not for defense, but for something deeper, like a reminder that someone else had once stood here and made decisions I was too late to understand. It must have been after midnight when I heard the first crunch of leaves outside the tent, soft and deliberate, not an animal, not the wind, not anything the forest wanted me to ignore. I froze, heart pausing mid-beat, breath locked in my throat, ears straining so hard they began to hum. It came again, another step, closer now, measured, not rushed, not hesitant. Someone walking, slow and with purpose, circling. I sat up without sound, my spine rigid, hands moving carefully as I lifted the flap of the tent and peered into the fog. Nothing, just white and shadow, the kind of darkness that moves when you look too hard. I waited, held my breath until it hurt. But no further steps came, only silence again, thick and familiar, the kind that wraps around the shoulders and whispers in your ear even when no one is near. I stepped outside, barefoot, boots still inside, the ground wet and cold beneath my feet. The fog curled around my legs like smoke from a dying fire, and I turned in place, slowly, carefully, eyes sweeping every inch of the clearing. Then I saw them, prints, clear in the soil, just beyond where the tent's shadow reached. Small, not children's, but not adult either. Not heavy enough to be Kaplan's, not wide enough for Mathers. They looked cautious, tentative, familiar in a way that made my stomach twist. The tracks formed a circle around the tent, a perfect loop, not wandering, not staggered, just one unbroken ring of steps moving clockwise. The stride was even, almost rehearsed, and there were no prints leading in or away, just the loop, just the silent evidence of presence without arrival. I knelt beside them and placed my hand against the closest one, palm hovering above the indentation in the dirt, and I felt it, warmth, faint and fading, but real, like the echo of a hand just pulled away, like someone had been standing there seconds before I looked. I followed the prints, walking the circle once, then again, counting each step, each turn, always ending up where I started. The loop never broke, never strayed. It was ritual, not accident, something meant to be seen, to be found. I thought of Telford, his obsession with pattern, the way he'd sit by the fire drawing the same symbol over and over in the dirt, a stick, a spiral, a ring, something he never explained and I never asked. Because there were always bigger fears back then. Back inside the tent, I sat with the knife across my knees and waited, not for the return of the footsteps, but for what they meant. I had begun to understand now that this place didn't forget, that it didn't forgive either. And every sound, every silence, every breath was part of something that had never ended. That night, the night they disappeared, hadn't passed, the way a storm passes. It had sunk into the earth and stayed, waiting, always waiting. I finally slept just before dawn, a restless drift into a dream that wasn't mine, a clearing filled with men standing in a circle, their faces turned away, all of them barefoot, eyes open, mouths closed, and in the center was the fire, still cold, still dark, but alive somehow, pulsing. And when I stepped forward, they all turned to look at me at once, eyes black, not empty, not blind, but full of something I couldn't name, something they had seen and carried into whatever place I hadn't. Followed, I woke, gasping, heartbeat in my teeth, the knife gripped so tightly in my hand, I had left an imprint in the skin. Outside, the fog had lightened slightly, enough that I could see the prints were gone, the circle broken, covered by new leaves or swept by something unseen. But I remembered them, every step, every turn, and I knew now they weren't a warning. They were a message I wasn't alone. I never had been, and whatever walked around me in the night wasn't trying to harm me. It was trying to tell me where to go next. The fog didn't lift that morning, but something shifted in it, like it had grown thinner in places. Not enough to see through, not enough to escape, just enough to move, to breathe, without feeling like every inhale was borrowed. I rose slowly from the tent, spine aching, knife still in hand, boots damp from the night before. The prints were gone, of course, the ring erased as if it had never existed, but I remembered the pattern. Every step burned into my mind like a song I'd never learned, but somehow still knew. And it led me, not by logic, not by compass, but by instinct, a direction that wasn't north or east, but something older, something deeper, something beneath. I walked for hours through terrain I should have remembered but didn't. Everything had changed in the way things do when no one is watching. Trees bent slightly different, paths where there had been none, hollows that hadn't existed during the campaign now deep with moss and stillness, the kind of stillness that means something is buried there. I followed the invisible thread, weaving through roots and broken stones, until I reached a part of the forest I didn't recognize, and that was saying something, because I had walked this region in patrols dozens of times during the occupation, drawn maps, marked coordinates, sent reports, but this place had never been in them, and yet it felt familiar in the way a dream feels familiar, before you realize you've never truly woken up. The trees here were older, their bark darker, their branches hanging lower, heavy as if they carried more than leaves, and in the center of this forgotten grove, beneath a canopy that let no light in, I saw it, the remains of a campfire, not new, not fresh, but not ancient either. The stones around it were blackened. The center collapsed inward with ash spread outward in a spiral, not scattered by wind but placed, deliberate, as if someone had drawn something there and then waited for it to be found. Approached carefully, crouched beside the ashes, and studied the pattern. At first it looked random, but patterns never are, not when soldiers leave them, and I saw it, slowly, not with the eyes, but with the memory. A loop here, a sharp corner there, 5 concentric arcs radiating from the center, each connected by a line, a crude map, not of geography but of motion, and at the center, a mark, an X, not carved, but burned deeper than the rest, as if someone had poured oil there and let it smoke. The pattern felt wrong, not in its design, but in its truth, because I recognized it. It was the way we had moved during our last patrol, the same formation, the same shifts, the same sudden pause near the ridge, the same final circle before we returned to camp, and everything fell apart. And in that realization came something colder than fog, the understanding that someone, or something, had watched us, had remembered better than I had etched our steps into ash like a warning, or worse, like a tribute. Beside the fire pit was a small bundle wrapped in canvas, half buried in leaves. I pulled it free, hands shaking, and opened it slowly, expecting bones or teeth or something worse. But instead I found a notebook, swollen with damp, its pages fused at the edges. I turned them carefully, page by page, each one covered in ink that had bled and run, but some of it remained legible. Not words exactly, not sentences, but sketches, marks, spirals, footprints, tree lines, and names, written over and over again in different hands. Kaplan, Dawson, Telford, Mathers, mine. The entries weren't dated, but the ink changed, sometimes black, sometimes red, once in what looked like charcoal, and each one more frantic than the last. until the pages became nothing but circles, page after page of rings, layered and overlapping, drawn so hard the tip of the pencil had broken through, as if whoever wrote them was trying to trap something on the page or escape from it. And on the final sheet, scrawled across the bottom in handwriting I recognized as my own, a sentence I did not remember writing. We were never alone. We only thought we were first. I dropped the book and stumbled back, stomach churning, heart hammering against the cage of my ribs. I stared at the fire pit again, at the spiral of ash, and felt the ground shift beneath me, not physically, but in truth, in meaning. The realization that this wasn't the first time I had stood here, that I had come here before, alone, or with the others. I couldn't say, but the memory was there now, unlocked, trembling behind my eyes. We had camped here, not officially, not recorded, not in reports, but I had led us here, maybe just for one night, maybe longer, maybe just to get away from the patrols, the rules, the pressure of expectation. And here, something had begun, a sound, a shadow, a silence that moved. I didn't remember the details yet, but the edges of them pressed closer now, the way fog thickens before it breaks. I picked up the book again, pressed it to my chest, and turned back toward camp, walking faster now, breath sharp in my throat, because I had to see the clearing again. I had to stand where the fire never warmed us, where the circle of prints had vanished, where Telford's blade had rested beneath moss for years, because now I understood what the spiral meant. It wasn't just a direction, it wasn't just a warning, it was a path, a descent, and I was already halfway down. The notebook didn't leave my hands for the rest of the day. I carried it like a relic, a weight that didn't press on my shoulders but settled into the hollow space just beneath the chest, the place where breath becomes memory and memory becomes command. I returned to the clearing as the light fell into that gray void it always did here, that strange hour between dusk and night, where the forest refused to decide whether it would reveal something or swallow everything whole. The fire pit looked the same, the tent still stood, and the silence waited for me like it always did. Not passive, not empty, but aware I sat on the same tree root where I used to clean my boots, where Mathers once carved his initials before carving them out again in shame. And I opened the notebook slowly, turned back to the last page, the one where my own handwriting declared something I didn't recall writing. We were never alone. We only thought we were first. I said the words aloud this time, carefully, as if testing their shape on my tongue might reveal something hidden inside them, but they didn't feel like mine. They felt borrowed, like someone had used my hand in the night and left behind a confession I didn't yet understand. The fog had crept in again, softer now, thinner maybe, or maybe I had simply learned how to see through it. It no longer felt like an obstacle, it felt like a language, and I had begun to learn the dialect of its stillness, the way it curled around my boots when I stepped too far, the way it thickened when I strayed from the clearing, the way it paused every time I said one of their names, as if it were listening, not with ears, but with presence. I sat in the quiet, notebook open, fingers brushing its edges, and I waited, not for warmth, not for answers, but for the thing I had started to suspect was waiting for me too. And then I heard it. Michael, my name again, but not from within the mind, not from memory, not imagined. It came from the trees, low and deliberate, spoken with the breath of someone who knew exactly how I would react. Not a shout, not a whisper, but a word spoken directly into the space between my spine and the air. I turned instantly, stood in one motion, knife already in hand out of habit, and scanned the fog. My heart didn't race. It slowed, the way it does when something ancient inside recognizes the pattern. The same way it had that first night when Dawson vanished. The same tone, the same sound, the same absence of echo. Michael again, this time to the left, farther, but closer in meaning. I moved without thinking, walked toward the sound as if on rails, the notebook tucked into my coat, the blade resting flat against my thigh. The trees passed by me like doors without hinges, the fog opening in brief slices only to close behind me again. I didn't question the direction. I followed it because I had followed voices my whole life, orders, warnings, last breaths, and this one was no different, except that it knew my name better than I did. I stopped when I reached the old radio stump, the one where we used to balance the antenna when the static was too thick, the one where I had last seen Mathers alive, hunched over with his ear pressed to the headphones, whispering, nodding, scratching something into his field log. That log hadn't been recovered and no one ever found the equipment, but I remembered the look on his face before he vanished. Not fear, not confusion, but recognition, like whatever he had heard through that hiss and crackle had called him by. Name, too. I stepped closer and saw something resting on the stump now, something that hadn't been there before. One of the radio headphones, cracked, wires frayed, black leather pad peeling, but unmistakably real, impossibly intact. I stared at it, breath tight in my chest, reached out slowly and placed 2 fingers against the side, expecting it to dissolve into fog, but it didn't. It stayed solid, cold, like it had been waiting for my touch. And the moment I made contact, Michael, louder now, in my head, but not from my mind, in both ears, like the moment before a transmission begins, that slight inhale on the other end of the line, and then, "Why didn't you come with us?" I pulled my hand back as if burned. The voice wasn't mine, wasn't anyone's I could place, but it carried the cadence of something known, something remembered in a fever dream, or in the second before waking. I backed away from the stump slowly, the fog holding still, not advancing, not receding, just watching. The notebook, inside my coat, felt heavier now, like it had absorbed the sound too, like it remembered the voice better than I did. I made my way back to the tent, slower this time, the trees not moving but my eyes catching glints in the bark, scratches, marks, maybe letters, maybe symbols, maybe the remnants of hands that had reached out too far. I didn't stop to study them, not yet, not tonight. I crawled into the tent and zipped it shut behind me like that could matter, like any canvas could keep the forest. From slipping inside, I sat with the knife across my knees and the notebook in my lap, and I waited again. The voice didn't return that night, or maybe it did, and I simply didn't recognize it the second time. Maybe it spoke through dreams now, through the creak of branches or the rhythm of my own heartbeat. But I knew this. What I heard wasn't an echo, wasn't memory, wasn't madness. It was presence, deliberate, waiting, and worst of all, it knew me. By morning, the fog had lifted slightly, not enough to reveal distance, but just enough to expose the shapes that had been waiting behind it. The trees no longer stood as silent walls, but as spectators, each one leaning slightly inward, as if listening, as if remembering something I hadn't said out loud. I rose without urgency, no longer expecting time to mean anything here. Each hour bled into the next with the rhythm of breath, slow and thick, the kind that settles into your limbs and never fully leaves. I didn't eat, didn't drink. I only moved, following the edge of the clearing, not out of curiosity, but because something had shifted during the night. Some alignment in the woods, some unseen line pulled taut like a wire humming through the air. I walked without gear, without rifle, only the blade and the notebook, now wrapped tightly in canvas to protect it from moisture. My boots moved quietly across the damp soil, the sound of my steps the only sign that I still belonged to the world of men. And then I saw it, at the far edge of the clearing, where 2 pines grew twisted into each other like lovers petrified mid-embrace. A letter affixed to the trunk of the larger one, held in place not by nail or tack or string, but by a single black thorn, long as a finger and driven clean through the parchment into bark. I froze, chest hollow, because I already knew what it would say, not the words, but the truth behind them, because this place didn't deal in coincidence, because this place only showed you what it wanted you to see when you were ready to be seen back. I stepped forward slowly, every part of my body aware of the moment, the stillness, the way the wind had paused, and the trees had stilled, and even the fog had pulled back, like breath, before a scream. The letter was folded once, yellowed by weather, the handwriting visible even before I touched it. Mine, unmistakably mine. The tilt of the R, the deep cut of the K in Rennick, the tight spacing that came when I wrote under stress. I reached out and touched the edge of the page, expecting it to crumble, expecting it to disintegrate into dust or blood or worse. But it didn't. It held, firm and dry and impossibly intact. I pulled it free from the thorn with a soft tug and unfolded it slowly, hands trembling not from cold but from memory. There were only 8 words, scrawled in thick, uneven lines, the kind that come from writing in darkness or panic or both. We followed you. Why didn't you wait? I read it once, then again, then a third time, hoping the words would shift, would resolve into something less familiar, something easier to deny. But they didn't, and with each repetition, something inside me cracked further, not broke, not yet, but bent with the weight of it. The question was simple, but it came with 1,000 voices, all of them wearing faces I remembered better than my own. Kaplan looking back over his shoulder as he vanished into fog, Dawson smiling, like he knew a secret, Telford silent, always silent. In the end, I turned the paper over hoping for more, for context, for explanation, but the back was blank, save for a faint smudge in the lower corner, a spiral drawn in what looked like charcoal or ash, the same shape I had seen in the notebook, the same shape the footsteps had followed around the tent, the same shape that now pulsed behind my eyelids every time I blinked. I sat beneath the tree and held the letter in my lap, trying to remember when I could have written it, where, how, but nothing came, only fragments. Mathers tuning the radio with bleeding fingers, Kaplan whispering to himself in a language I didn't recognize, a fire that wouldn't catch even though the wood was dry, and my own voice, always my voice, saying go now, move, and the shadows that followed without question. Was it possible I had left them, that I had given the order, that I had fled and told myself the opposite to survive it? The idea lodged in my chest like shrapnel, not pain but pressure, something sharp that kept me from breathing too deep. I wanted to stand, to walk, to scream, but I couldn't, because if I moved, the trees might answer, and I wasn't ready for that, not yet. The forest had grown quieter again, not silent, not dead, but reverent, like it had witnessed a confession and was waiting for me to kneel, to admit what I had done or not done, what I had failed to stop. The letter remained in my hand for hours, and I read it, again and again, and each time the words grew heavier, not with guilt, but with recognition. We followed you. Why didn't you wait? I wanted to believe I had been trying to save them, that I had stayed as long as I could, that the fog had stolen them before I had the chance to act. But what if I had made the choice? What if I had drawn the spiral myself? What if the fire hadn't gone out but had been snuffed? What if the silence wasn't something that happened to us but something I created? When I stopped calling their names, I rose before nightfall, letter folded and placed into the notebook, and walked back to the tent, slower now, not with fatigue, but with the weight of the spiral circling tighter in my chest. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the knife across my lap and stared at the flame I didn't light, and I whispered all their names in a loop, again and again, as if repetition could rewrite history, as if the trees would let go if I proved I still remembered. But nothing came. No answer, no echo, only the cold, and somewhere just beyond the edge of hearing, a sound like a footstep or a breath, or the start of a voice trying to say my name again. I woke before light returned. If it ever really returned in this place, the forest doesn't allow sunrise, not in the way it's known elsewhere. Here the world simply lightens slightly, reluctantly, like a held breath released in shame. I sat up inside the tent without opening my eyes, knowing something had changed. Not the cold, not the fog, but the weight of the air, the pressure of presence, like someone had stepped into the clearing and waited until I stirred to be acknowledged. I didn't speak. I didn't reach for the blade. I only listened, the same way a man listens when he realizes the silence has started watching him. When I finally stepped outside, the fog had thinned just enough to reveal shapes in the ground, small mounds of earth, evenly spaced, placed not with clumsy hands but with care, 6 of them, arranged in a circle around where the fire should have been, not random, not scattered by wind or storm, but deliberate, precise, ritual, each one no more than a hand's width high. And at the center, where I had failed night after night to light warmth, were my boots. They were positioned neatly, side by side, toes pointed west, not toward the path out of the forest, but toward the tree line where the fog always thickened first, where Dawson had vanished, where the voice had come from 2 nights ago. My boots had been cleaned, the dried mud gone, the frayed laces retied, the leather polished in places I hadn't touched in years. They looked like they had the day I was first issued them, stiff with discipline, heavy with unearned purpose, and yet I hadn't moved them. I hadn't removed them from the tent. I had slept with them beside me. I had felt them against my leg. I crouched slowly, touched one of the boots, the left, my hand trembling as if I expected it to recoil, but it was warm, not from sun or fire, but from the kind of heat that lingers after being held, I pulled my hand back and looked at the mounds surrounding the fire pit, each one crowned by a small object. Dawson's compass, rusted but intact. Kaplan's cigarette tin, still half full. Mather's harmonica, mouthpiece cracked. Telford's field knife, returned to the ground where I had first found it. And beside that, 2 more I didn't recognize, but somehow knew belonged to the 2 soldiers whose names I had forgotten, the ones who had never been listed on the reports, the ones who had followed anyway. I sat in the dirt and stared at the circle for what felt like hours, watching the fog coil and uncoil around the boots, like smoke rising from a memory. They had brought them here, whoever they were now, whatever they had become. They had brought my boots from inside the tent and placed them here, not as threat, not as mockery, but as invitation, as reminder, as a request. It was a ritual, theirs or mine. I couldn't say any more. But the message was clear. This was their fire now. This was their space, and I was standing inside something sacred, or cursed, or both. I took the notebook from my coat, opened it to the last blank page, and began to draw the circle, not from memory, but from instruction. My hand moved without hesitation, each mound, each relic, the boots at the center, the spacing perfect, the angles exact. And when I was done, I realized I had drawn it before, weeks ago, maybe years, maybe back at the outpost, maybe in the dirt with a stick while the others smoked in silence. The shape lived inside me now, had lived inside me then, and all I had done was give it form again. The forest didn't speak, but it waited. It always waited, and I knew what it wanted now. Not answers, not guilt, not even repentance, but return, not to them, but to the moment, to the breach, to the place where I had made the decision to keep walking when I should have stood still, or the other way around. It didn't matter anymore. The spiral was closing and I had reached its center. The boots were no longer mine, or perhaps they always had been, but they didn't belong to walking anymore. They belonged to remaining, to grounding, to rooting myself in the place where the fire refused to burn. I didn't put them on. I left them where they had been placed. I stepped around them, careful not to disturb the earth, and returned to the tent, barefoot, the soil soft beneath my feet, warm in patches, cold in others, alive in ways I couldn't explain without surrendering the language of logic. I sat in the entrance, knees to my chest, and waited for the fog to speak again. And it did, not in voice, but in shape, the tendrils curling into letters across the clearing, spelling names I hadn't said in days, spelling mine last, then unraveling into mist again. By the time darkness came, the circle was gone, not erased, just absorbed, the boots still in place, the mounds flattened back into the ground, the relics vanished or reclaimed, and I understood now that it was never about finding them, not in the way I had thought, not bodies or bones or dog tags to mail home. It was about seeing them, truly seeing them, in the shape of absence, in the place where sound ends and something else begins. And in that stillness, in that moment of surrender, I whispered, "Thank you," not to them, but to the fog, because it had never stopped showing me the truth. Even when I had done everything to avoid looking, I stopped counting the days. The moment I accepted that time didn't pass here the way it did out there, that it folded into itself like the spiral I had traced 100 times into ash and dirt and memory, I no longer marked mornings by the light through the trees, because the light didn't return anymore. It only hovered, a dull gray hum that rose and fell like breath, like sleep that never reaches waking. I ate less, drank only when the fog condensed enough to gather in the folds of the tent. I spoke rarely, only when a name rose inside me too painfully to keep down. And even then I said it softly, not expecting it to echo, only needing it to exist. I didn't leave the clearing again, not because I couldn't, not because the trees wouldn't allow it, but because I understood now that the spiral didn't move outward, it moved inward, and I had reached the center, where the boots still stood in perfect posture, still pointed west, still waiting, not for steps, but for stillness. The fireless circle had vanished into earth, but I saw it in everything, in the shape of the clouds above the tent, in the cracks forming along my knuckles, in the way my breath coiled around my throat before dissolving. I read through the notebook one last time, every page, even the ones that had blurred into ink blots and smudges. I traced each line with my finger, as if I could understand the rhythm behind the panic, the message behind the madness. And when I reached the end, the very last page, there was something new, not ink, not knied, written but pressed into the paper with something sharp, almost invisible. But when I held it toward the faint light, I saw the indentations clearly, words I hadn't written, words that hadn't been there before. You were the last one to leave. That was all. No name, no signature, no date, just that sentence, cut deep into the fibers like a scar that would never fade. And I understood then, fully, completely, that I had left them. Maybe not physically, maybe not intentionally, but I had crossed some threshold that night, some silent line in the fog that couldn't be uncrossed. Maybe I had given an order I no longer remembered. Maybe I had run. Maybe I had stood still while they disappeared one by one into something I didn't dare follow. And I had told myself it wasn't my fault. And I had written reports to justify my presence and their absence. And I had carried that lie into every day that came after. But the forest knew, the spiral knew, and they knew. So I stopped waiting for rescue. Because no one was coming. Not from the north. Not from the command post. Not from the world that had forgotten this war even happened in this patch of woods. I stopped looking for trails, for footprints, for bones, because I had realized that this place didn't bury its dead. It held them, kept them whole in ways I couldn't see but always felt. And in doing so, it had kept part of me too, long before I returned. Long before I remembered, I buried the notebook beneath the stump where the fire pit had once burned cold, not with a marker, not with a farewell, just placed it under the soil like a seed, like something that didn't need to grow but needed to rest. I left the blade beside it, no longer a weapon, no longer a tool, just weight that wasn't mine anymore. And I returned to the boots, still warm, still polished, still facing the same direction I didn't put them on. I knelt beside them and placed my bare hand over the toe of the left one and closed my eyes. And in that silence, I felt them again. Not their voices, not their faces, but their presence. The way it used to be during the long waits between orders. The way a unit becomes something more than men, something tethered, something indivisible. And I understood then that I wasn't alone, not because they were coming back, but because I had never left. I sat beneath the same tree every day after that. Not writing, not drawing, just breathing, just existing. And the fog didn't rise again, not completely. It stayed low and soft, curling around my feet like an old dog waiting to rest its head. The forest no longer threatened, no longer whispered. It just was, and I was part of it now. When the memories returned, I didn't fight them. I let them pass through me like wind through leaves. I remembered the laughter, the quiet rage, the singing at night when no one thought I was listening. I remembered the way Kaplan used to write his name on every object he owned, as if afraid the war would erase him. I remembered the way Telford never answered questions directly, and how Mathers whispered prayers in Yiddish even though he claimed he didn't believe in anything but coffee and clean socks. And I remembered myself, not the man who filed the reports, not the man who saluted and took medals and said the right words, but the man who sat in the cold while his men vanished, and who waited too long to speak their names out loud. Now I speak them every day, and no one answers, and that's how I know they're listening. Because they've become what I have. The watchers, the remembered, the roots beneath a forest that never forgets. I am not missing, I am not dead, but I no longer belong to the world that names such things. I am the man who stayed after the war ended, and the spiral is closed. Historia 3. I walked the last mile in boots that no longer felt like mine, the leather cracked from salt and mud, the soles barely gripping the gravel of the old road that curved between the cornfields and the stream bed where I taught my son to skip stones before I left. The bus dropped me off near the general store in town, but I didn't want to be seen, not like this, not with the duffel on my back and my coat still stained from a country I never want to speak of again. The sky was gray in that way only late autumn knows, like it's trying to hide what it knows is already dying. And as I reached the bend where the wooden fence leans too far over the ditch, I saw the house. My house. Our house. The house I had spent every day thinking about in that German camp, freezing at night and digging frozen ground with my fingers, just to keep from forgetting what warmth once felt like. But when I saw it now, I didn't feel warmth. I felt cold, immediate, unspoken, a stillness in the bones. The curtains were drawn. The barn door swung open on a rusted hinge, clapping faintly in the wind like an old man's breath. The swing I built for Benjamin no longer hung straight. It was twisted around the branch like a rope trying to strangle the tree, and there was no smoke from the chimney, no sign of life at all. I opened the gate and stepped into the yard, the gravel cracking beneath me like it was trying to announce me to a home that didn't want to hear. The front porch had leaves blown up against the steps, and the rocking chair where my wife used to sit with a book didn't rock anymore. I climbed the steps slowly, pressed my hand to the door and turned the knob. It wasn't locked. I hadn't written. I hadn't warned them. Maybe I should have, but I wanted it to be like it was, just once. I stepped inside, expecting to hear the echo of a voice or the thump of little feet on the floorboards above. Maybe the smell of stew on the stove, or at least the ticking of the clock in the hall. Instead, I found silence. Real silence. The kind that presses on your chest like guilt. The living room was clean. Too clean. Like it had been left for someone else to find. The clock had stopped. 2:47, and the picture frames on the wall still held the same photos, but something was off. One of them was missing, the one of me, Sarah, and Benjamin at the lake. The one she loved so much she kept it in a silver frame. Gone. I walked through the house slowly. No signs of a struggle, no mess, just absence. In the kitchen, there were no dishes in the sink, no food in the pantry. Upstairs, the bed was made, but the closet was half empty, hangers swaying slightly like someone had just been there. Benjamin's room still had his toys on the shelves, his blanket folded at the foot of the bed, his boots lined up perfectly by the door, but the bed hadn't been slept in for weeks, maybe months. I walked back outside and around the house toward the field. The sky had darkened. I passed the vegetable garden, now overgrown, and the row of fence posts I had promised to replace, but it was when I reached the back of the barn that I saw them, marks in the dirt, digging. Someone had taken a spade to the earth not long ago. The soil was uneven, darker, still soft in places. A rectangle, long and narrow, about the size of a small body. My breath caught. I knelt beside it, touched the earth. It was too recent, too fresh. The grass hadn't grown back. Flies hovered just above the surface, but there was no smell, no rot, just silence again. There was no stone, no marker, just a piece of wood, nailed into a cross, leaning slightly as if it knew it didn't belong there. No name, no date, just a grave that shouldn't have existed. I stared at it, feeling nothing and everything at once. My hands shook, my chest was hollow. I tried to call out his name, but the sound died in my throat. There should have been weeping. There should have been someone to tell me, to explain, to hold me, but there was no one. Just the wind and the rusted creak of the barn door, opening wider now, and the sound of a shovel still echoing in my ears. I stood up and looked toward the hills, toward the edge of the property, where the road leads to town. There were no cars, no neighbors. The mailbox was empty. I walked back into the house and found the dresser drawer where Sarah used to keep letters and notes and lists. It was empty except for one item, a photograph, folded in half. I opened it. It was Benjamin, sitting on the porch, his face turned toward someone outside the frame. The photo had been torn and taped back together. The tape was brittle. I turned it over. No message, no date. Night fell quickly. I lit the lamp in the kitchen, though the oil was low. I sat at the table and waited. For what? I didn't know. Maybe a knock at the door, maybe a voice, but no one came. I didn't sleep. I watched the window as the moon slid slowly across the sky and the shadows crept back toward the barn. I listened for her voice. I listened for his laugh, but the house remained still. When the sun rose, I stepped back outside. The grave was still there. The dirt had sunk slightly. I found the spade in the barn, still damp with earth, and there were footprints, small, leading away from the cross, not toward it. I found her 2 days later, after walking from one end of the valley to the other with a name in my mouth and a question I couldn't yet form. The town hadn't changed, not really. The same drugstore on the corner with the bell above the door. The same schoolhouse where the children's laughter used to spill out into the dusty street like water from a cracked bucket, and the same way people paused when they saw me, eyes wide, lips parted, as if they weren't sure if they were looking at a man or the memory of one. I didn't tell them who I was. I didn't need to. My name was still painted on the crate in front of the hardware store, Grayson Farm Fresh Eggs and Milk, though the letters had begun to peel. People knew. They just didn't want to say it out loud. At the church, Reverend Holloway didn't meet my gaze. He said she had come to him some weeks back, asking for help, asking if it was a sin to bury someone without a priest. He hadn't answered her. Said she looked like she hadn't slept in a month. I asked him where she went. He didn't speak, just pointed east. She was working in a boarding house kitchen when I saw her. Hair tied back, apron dusted with flour, face thinner than I remembered. She didn't see me at first. She was placing biscuits on a tray, hands moving like she'd done it 1,000 times, a rhythm made of habit and survival. I stood in the doorway, letting the heat of the stove brush against me, while something colder bloomed inside my chest. When she finally turned, she dropped a plate. The crash didn't break her silence. She looked at me like I had clawed my way out of the ground. "Matthew," she whispered. That was all. Not a scream, not a cry, just my name, flat, brittle, like it hurt her to speak it. I stepped into the room. She didn't move. I wanted to run to her, to hold her, to ask 100 questions all at once. But something in her face stopped me. She wasn't surprised. She was afraid. I asked where Benjamin was. She looked down. I asked again. She didn't answer. I said I saw the grave. I said I saw the cross. I said I saw the spade, the fresh dirt, the photograph, the empty boots, the silent room, the house that had folded in on itself without goodbye. She covered her mouth with her hand. I stepped closer. "How did he die?" I asked. She shook her head. "Where?" I pressed. Still no answer. "When?" I asked again. Her eyes filled with water, but not tears. Her throat moved like she wanted to say something, but her voice had forgotten how. She sat down at the small table by the window and stared at the wall. I took the seat across from her. We sat there, not as husband and wife, but as two people who had once shared a life, and now only shared silence. "He was fine when I left," I said. "He waved goodbye. He said he'd wait for me." She nodded. "I wrote you," I said. "Every month." "I know," she said softly. "Did you read them?" "No," she said. "They stopped coming." "Who buried him?" I asked. She closed her eyes. I felt the heat rising in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Just confusion so deep it burned. "Who dug the hole?" Her hand trembled. "Sarah," I said, firmer now. "Who put him in the ground?" She finally looked at me. "You were gone," she said. "No one thought you'd come back. The army sent a letter. They said your whole unit was gone. The chaplain came. They held a service. People cried. I stopped breathing. I listened. And then one night," she said, her voice falling into itself, "I heard him scream." I didn't move. She continued. "It was late. I ran to his room. He was sitting in the corner, shaking. He wouldn't speak. He just pointed out the window. There was no one there. Nothing. He didn't sleep after that. He stopped eating. He just kept saying the same thing." "What?" I asked. He said something came to the house." I leaned in. "He said it talked to him through the wall," she said. "He said it didn't have a face, that it made promises, that it knew your name." I sat back, the floor tilting slightly under my feet. "He died that night?" I asked. She shook her head. "No." "When then?" "I don't know," she said. "What do you mean you don't know?" "I woke up," she said. "He wasn't in his bed. The door was open. The barn was open. I found the shovel lying in the yard. I waited. I followed the trail to the back," she said. "He was gone, but the hole was there. And the box was half buried. You mean someone—" "I didn't see who, but the earth was warm." She looked up at me, and now her eyes did tear. "It wasn't right," she whispered. "It didn't feel like death. It felt like a door being closed." I stood slowly. She didn't stop me. "I'm going back," I said. She didn't answer. As I walked away, she called after me. Not with words, just sound, broken and sharp and frightened. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I carried her silence with me, heavier than the duffel on my back, heavier than the years I lost across the ocean. My son was dead, but not buried, not really. And if she couldn't explain it, the earth would. The grave sat behind the barn like a secret whispered too loud, half swallowed by weeds that had no business growing that fast in this time of year, as if the land itself was trying to cover up what had been done in silence. I stood before it long before dawn, the horizon still a smudge of charcoal behind the trees, the grass wet with dew or tears, I couldn't tell which. The wooden cross leaned slightly to the left, tilted like a man too tired to stand straight. There was no name on it, no date, no words at all, just two uneven planks nailed together by someone in a hurry or someone who didn't care. And that's what cut the deepest. This wasn't a grave prepared with love or sorrow. It was a burial done in absence, in panic, in erasure. They had buried my son without a name, without a ceremony, without a father, without me. I knelt down and placed my hand on the dirt. The ground was soft, still sinking, and under the surface I could feel the disturbance of the soil, the uneven layering that betrayed a rushed job. Whoever had done this hadn't used a coffin. Not really. More like a crate. I knew the feel of hasty burials. I'd seen enough in Europe. Men shoved into trenches with nothing more than dog tags and prayers whispered through gritted teeth. But this wasn't war. This was home. And yet it felt more foreign than any battlefield I'd ever bled on. I sat there for what must have been an hour, just breathing, letting the weight of it all push against my ribs, refusing to cry, because crying felt like an acceptance I wasn't ready for. I thought of Benjamin's face, the way he used to run to the gate every time he heard a truck pass, thinking it might be me. I thought of the way he pronounced uniform, like unicorn, the way he insisted I show him how to salute every morning before school. And now he was under the earth, boxed in by strangers, buried without so much as a marker to remind the world he ever laughed. My jaw clenched hard enough to hurt, my hands dug into the dirt, and that's when I noticed the rope. It wasn't much, just a fragment, frayed and buried shallow near the head of the grave, almost invisible beneath the grass. I pulled it gently, expecting it to give. It didn't. I dug around it and followed the length until I found the knot, tied in a loop. My stomach turned. It was a tether, a restraint, the kind used to hold a child still. Not a burial rope, but something else. My hand shook as I let it go. I looked back toward the barn. The doors were closed now. I was sure I'd left them open. I returned to the house, each step heavier than the last. Inside, everything felt smaller, the walls closer, the shadows deeper. I went into Benjamin's room and sat on his bed. His pillow still smelled like him, like soap and hay, and the faint trace of sugar from the lemon drops he used to sneak before dinner. I opened the drawer of his nightstand, crayons, marbles, a half-broken slingshot, and at the bottom, folded carefully, was a piece of paper. I opened it slowly. It was a drawing, a house like ours, with stick figures out front, me, him, and Sarah. But off to the side, drawn in thick black crayon, was a fourth figure, taller, no face, long arms that stretched toward the child, and written beneath it, in Benjamin's shaky handwriting, "He watches when you sleep." I closed the paper and stared at the wall. Something had happened here, something no one wanted to speak of, something deeper than grief, and stranger than death. The next day, I went to town. I walked into the sheriff's office and asked if there'd been a death report filed for my son. He shuffled through papers, looked uncomfortable, scratched the back of his neck, and finally said there hadn't. I asked about a doctor, a coroner, anyone who had signed off on the death. He said no name was ever entered. I asked if that seemed strange to him. He didn't answer. At the diner, I asked the waitress if she remembered Sarah bringing Benjamin in. She nodded, said they used to come every Thursday. I asked when the last time was. She paused, said it had been the week before I died, that Benjamin had looked pale, quiet, said he wouldn't eat, just stared at the window like someone was watching from the street. I asked her if she remembered anything else. She said he left a note under the napkin. She'd found it after they left. Still had it. Brought it out from under the register, yellowed and creased. 3 words, written in block letters. "Dad is next." I folded it and put it in my pocket. I returned home that evening and stood once more before the grave. I brought a lantern and a spade. I didn't care what they thought. I didn't care if the neighbors saw. I was going to dig. I needed to see him. I needed to know. The first few inches came up easy, then heavier. The deeper I went, the harder the soil became, until I hit something solid. Not wood, not bone, stone, a slab. I cleared it. It was shaped like a lid, but not for a coffin. It was a cover. There were markings on it, carved deep into the surface. Symbols, circles, spirals, and a name etched faintly in the middle. Benjamin Grayson. I reached for the edge. The stone was cold, too cold. I tried to lift it. It wouldn't move, not an inch. And beneath my feet, I felt the faintest tremor, like the earth had shifted to hold it in place, like the grave wasn't ready to open, like whatever was buried there was not done sleeping. The old man lived across the field behind the pine row, in the crooked house with the red shutters that hadn't been painted since the war before mine. I hadn't spoken to Hale in years, not since my father died, and the line between our properties became a silent agreement rather than a shared fence. But I remembered his face, and the way his eyes always seemed too sharp for someone that old, like he saw more than what was in front of him. The morning after I tried to lift the stone from my boy's grave, I walked the slope toward his porch with the kind of caution you use when you're not sure if you're going to find answers or more things to bury. He was already sitting there when I arrived, a tin cup in one hand, a rusted dog curled at his feet that didn't bother to bark. He looked up at me like he'd been expecting me for years. "You look thinner," he said, not as a greeting but as a fact. "I've been gone," I answered, and he nodded like that part wasn't news. "War doesn't feed a man," he said, then motioned to the chair opposite him. I sat down and waited. He didn't ask where I'd been or what I'd seen or why my eyes kept drifting toward the trees. He just sipped his drink and let the silence weigh between us, until it bent. "I need to ask you about that night," I said. "I figured you would," he said. "When Benjamin died." He nodded, slow, like the name carried dust. "Your wife came running here the next morning," he said. "She was barefoot, shaking, asked to use the phone. Said something terrible had happened." "Did she say what?" I asked. "No," he said, and I didn't ask. I looked at him hard, but I know what I heard. I leaned forward. "What did you hear?" He set the tin cup down. "Screaming," he said, "but not that night." I waited. "It was the night before," he said, "around 3 in the morning. Sharp. Not the kind of sound a child makes when he's afraid of the dark. It was deeper, like something pulled from the throat." "You're sure of the time?" I asked. "I don't sleep much, and I never forget what I hear." "You heard him?" "I think I did, and something else." "Like what?" He didn't answer right away. "I've heard animals in pain," he said slowly. "Coyotes getting into the chicken pens, deer being brought down by dogs. I've heard metal twist, and engines scream, and even a woman giving birth in the backseat of a truck during the flood of '29. He paused. "This wasn't any of those." He looked at me. "This sounded like something being ripped out of the world." My stomach clenched. "And then it stopped," he said, "all at once, like it was swallowed." He looked past me, toward the barn on my property, now barely visible through the trees. "And a few minutes after that, I saw headlights." I turned to follow his gaze. "Your brother's truck," he said. "Jonathan?" I asked. He nodded. "He came up the road from your place, driving fast. Lights off. Didn't stop. Just disappeared down the hill." I swallowed the bitterness in my mouth. "He told me he was helping Sarah," I said. "I don't doubt it," Hale said. "But I also don't trust a man who leaves the house of a mother whose child just vanished in the night without knocking to ask if she needs anything." "Did you see him again?" I asked. "Next day," he said. "Back at your place. Around sunset. He was in the barn, with Sarah. Doors closed. I watched from the hill. They argued. She left. He stayed. My pulse beat harder in my ears." "He stayed the night?" I asked. "No," Hale said. "He didn't stay. He disappeared." "What do you mean?" "I mean 1 minute he was there, standing in the open barn doorway, and the next minute the light inside flickered, and he was gone. Just gone." "You didn't go down." "I may be old," he said, "but I'm not a fool." I stood. "Thank you," I said. "Whatever's buried out there," he said. "It didn't come from you, but it might be waiting for you." I left without another word. The wind followed me down the slope. When I reached the barn, I pushed the door open. The air was cold, too cold. The same place I had once stored hay and tools now felt like a room that remembered screams. I walked to the back, to the spot where Hale said he had seen my brother vanish. There were footprints in the dirt, old, but there. One set, then none, and behind the tool shed wall there was a wooden hatch I had never opened. I pulled it. It groaned like something waking, and the smell that came up from the dark below wasn't death. It was soil, turned, stirred, hungry. I stood outside his house longer than I should have, staring at the porch where our mother used to sit and knit scarves in the dead heat of summer just to keep her hands from trembling. The same porch where Jonathan and I once took turns carving our initials into the railing until there was no clean wood left. And now it was his porch, his house, his life laid over the bones of mine like a coat that never quite fit. And I wondered if he ever felt the weight of it, or if it sat on him, like something he'd earned. I hadn't spoken to him since my return, not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't ready to hear his voice wrapped around explanations I wouldn't believe. But the hole behind my barn wasn't getting shallower, and the silence in Sarah's mouth wasn't filling itself with answers. And Hale's story about headlights in the night wasn't the kind of thing you carry without doing something about it. So I climbed the steps and knocked. He opened the door like he'd been standing on the other side the whole time, like he felt me coming. And for a second I saw surprise in his eyes, but it faded too fast to trust. He smiled, but not all the way. just enough to say he remembered how. "Matt," he said, like we were still boys, like time hadn't torn something between us. I didn't return the smile. "Can we talk?" I asked. He stepped aside. Inside, the house smelled like cedar and ash, warm and clean, too lived in for someone who wasn't supposed to be living there. The walls were the same, the furniture rearranged, the photos on the mantel different. No wedding picture, no Benjamin, just him, in uniform at the county fair. Beside the tractor he used to joke was his true first love. I sat in our father's old chair. He didn't ask why I'd come. He poured 2 drinks and handed me one. "I heard you were back," he said. "Is that what people are saying?" I asked. He nodded. "Back from the dead," he said. I drank. "What were you doing at my house the night Benjamin died?" I asked. He paused. "I came to help." "Help who?" "Sarah." "With what?" He looked down at his glass. "She called me," he said. "Said Benjamin was gone. Said she didn't know what to do. I came to keep her from falling apart. Did you go in the barn?" He nodded. "Why?" "She said she heard something." "What did you hear?" He looked up at me now, and for the first time I saw fear. Real fear. Not the kind that comes from guilt. The kind that stays with you after a bad dream follows you into daylight. "It sounded like him," he said. "But it wasn't?" He shook his head. "I don't know." I leaned forward. "Did you help bury him?" His face tightened. "She said he was already gone," he said. "She said there was no time, that something was wrong, that it wouldn't let her leave until it was done." "What wouldn't let her?" He didn't answer. I stood. He grabbed my arm. "Don't go back out there," he said. "Why not?" "Because there's something under that ground," he said. "Something that's been there longer than any of us." I pulled away. "Then why did you stay?" I asked. He didn't respond. "Why are you in my house?" I asked. "Because it was empty," he said. "And I didn't want to be alone." I walked toward the door. "Matt," he said behind me. "I didn't take your life." I turned. "No," I said. "You just moved into it before the body got cold." He didn't follow me. I stepped off the porch and looked back once. The curtains upstairs moved. Someone was watching. The night was falling fast. When I got home, I didn't light a lamp. I walked straight to the barn. The hatch was still open. I climbed down. The air below was thicker, heavy with the smell of damp stone and something older than rot. My lantern barely lit more than a few feet ahead, but I could see the dirt walls of a tunnel, narrow and low, leading away from the foundation. It had been dug with purpose, not by an animal, not by a man. I crawled through. The walls pulsed with moisture. The silence was complete, like the earth was holding its breath. And then I heard it. A shuffle, a whisper, my name. And the voice was his, not Jonathan's, Benjamin's. I didn't sleep after crawling out of that tunnel. I couldn't. The voice followed me even above ground. Not loud, not constant, but there, on the edge of each thought, in the breath between my own, as if the silence was no longer mine alone. I sat on the porch until dawn, lantern empty beside me, hands shaking from something colder than fear. I thought about Sarah and the grave and Jonathan and that whisper in the dark saying my name in a voice too soft to belong to a corpse. I thought about how the ground never lets go of what it's fed, and how sometimes it doesn't just keep the body, it keeps something else, something that listens, something that waits. It was late morning when I made my way to the church. I hadn't been inside it since the day before I left for Europe, when the Reverend had laid his hand on my shoulder and told me God goes with all men, even those who no longer feel him. The town hadn't changed it much. The same cracked bell, the same stained glass window that filtered light into strange colors across the pews, the same wooden cross above the altar that always seemed too small for the weight it was supposed to carry. But inside, it felt different now, not just emptier, thicker, like the air was heavier inside than it had any right to be. Reverend Holloway stood at the front, wiping the rail with a cloth already streaked with dust and candle wax. He didn't look surprised to see me, just tired. "You're here for the letter," he said before I even spoke. I stopped halfway down the aisle. "What letter?" I asked, though I already knew. He nodded slowly, then walked to a drawer beside the altar and pulled out a folded envelope. He held it like it might burn him if he kept it too long. "She brought it to me the night before the funeral," he said. "Said it wasn't for me to read. Said it was for you. Asked me to keep it safe until you returned. But I never did," I said. He nodded. "Not to her, anyway." I stepped forward and reached for the envelope. He pulled it back slightly. "I didn't open it," he said. "Not then." "But you did," I said. He didn't deny it. "It was wrong," he said. "But something about her eyes, I needed to know. I needed to understand why she shook like she was hearing something I couldn't. He handed it to me. I opened it slowly, careful not to tear the creases. It wasn't Sarah's handwriting. It was Miss Avery's, Benjamin's teacher. Dear Reverend, I hope this letter finds you before anything happens, because I fear there's not much time left. Benjamin Grayson is not well. I don't mean sick, I mean afraid. Deeply, profoundly afraid in a way I've only seen once before, and that child didn't live long. Benjamin has stopped speaking in class. He only writes. Pages and pages of drawings, most of them black spirals or shapes I can't describe. He says he hears something under the ground at night. He says it speaks to him through the walls. Last week he showed me scratches on his arm. He said he didn't make them. He said it did. When I asked who it was, he said it didn't have a name, that it didn't need one, that it already knew his. He says it comes from the earth, from tunnels, that it walks through places people forgot, that it visits when the clocks stop. He told me something terrible is going to happen to his father, that something followed him across the sea. He said it told him his father would die if he didn't give it something else first. He said he didn't want to. I don't know what to do. I'm writing this in case I'm too late. If anything happens to that boy, someone has to know he tried to warn us. Please, watch the house. Elizabeth Avery. I didn't feel the letter fall from my hand. The Reverend watched me like he'd already seen the rest of this story and knew he couldn't stop it. I shouldn't have read it, he said again. But you did, I answered. He nodded. And then what? I asked. I tried to talk to her, to Miss Avery, and she was gone. Gone? He looked down. They said she left town, but her things were still in the schoolhouse. Her car was still parked out back. Her key was still on her desk. She never came home. When was this? I asked. The day before they buried Benjamin. I stepped back, breath tight in my chest. You buried him here? I asked. He shook his head. She wouldn't let me, he said. Said it had to be at the house. Said that's where it all started, and that's where it had to end. But you went, I said. He hesitated. I stood by the fence, he admitted. Watched from the hill. I saw Jonathan there. I saw Sarah. I saw the boy's body wrapped in something dark, but I never got close. Why not? He looked me in the eye. Because I heard my own name, he said. I didn't understand. He continued, voice quieter now. It was faint, from the barn, like a whisper under a floorboard, but it said my name. I stepped away. He didn't follow. As I reached the door, he called after me. I tore the letter because I didn't want to believe it. I taped it back together because I couldn't forget it. But you, Matthew, you were never meant to read it. I turned. Then who was? He looked at the cross above him, the thing under the ground. The hours turned heavy after the church. I spent the rest of the day moving through the house like I was being watched, like every step I took stirred dust from a place that didn't want to be disturbed. I kept thinking about that letter, the way the words crawled across the page like they weren't written for people but for something else. Something that waits under floorboards and speaks in whispers when the sun goes down. I didn't light any candles that night. I didn't sit on the porch or walk the fields. I stayed inside, watching the hands of the kitchen clock move with a rhythm that no longer matched anything in me. The Reverend's words replayed again and again, and somewhere deep beneath that repetition I kept hearing it. My son's name, spoken in a voice I hadn't heard in years, too soft to be real and too persistent to ignore. It was just past midnight when the house shifted, not loudly, not even noticeably if you weren't waiting for it, but I was. The floor creaked near the back door, and the air inside turned colder, and I knew then, without needing to check, that the barn door had opened. I stood slowly, the weight of everything pressing down on me like a wet coat I couldn't take off, and walked through the kitchen, past the hallway where Benjamin's drawings still hung crooked on the wall, into the yard where the wind had gone still. The barn stood wide open, the darkness inside blacker than the sky above, and as I stepped into it, I felt something shift, not in the wood, not in the air, but in me. The smell was stronger now, not rot, not mold, soil, rich, alive, and wrong. The kind of smell you only notice when the earth has opened for reasons it shouldn't have. I held the lantern tight even though it wasn't lit. My hands needed something to believe in. The hatch to the crawl space was still loose from the night I went down. I knelt beside it, listening, breath caught in my throat. For a moment there was only silence. Then it came, a voice, my son's voice, calling me, not like a dream, not like memory, but real, rooted in the boards, echoing up through the hatch like wind rising from a well. Dad, it said, a whisper. Then again, Dad. I didn't move. Help me. My throat closed. My heart pounded like it had in combat. In the woods outside Berlin, when the mortars fell and the ground shook and I thought I'd never see home again. But this wasn't war. This was worse, because it was his voice, because it knew my name. I opened the hatch. The smell hit me harder this time, like the breath of something ancient forced through a mouth too small to hold it. The tunnel below was darker than before, and yet I could see. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. The walls glistened. Something pulsed behind the dirt. The wooden ladder creaked as I stepped down. When I reached the bottom, the voice was louder. "Help me, Dad." It came from the far end, from the place where the tunnel bent, where the light used to fade. I walked slowly, ducking low, breathing shallow. The walls seemed closer now, the air thicker. I could feel moisture against my cheeks, my arms, my neck. It wasn't sweat, it wasn't water, it was breath. The tunnel opened slightly ahead, not into a room, but into a space that had no walls, no ceiling, just black. And from that black, something stood, small, thin, like a child. It looked like Benjamin, but it wasn't. The proportions were wrong. The way the head tilted, the arms too long, the skin too smooth. The eyes, God, the eyes. They were open too wide and yet saw nothing. They shimmered without reflecting. "Dad," it said again. I stepped back. It stepped forward. "Don't you love me?" it asked. I couldn't speak. It reached for me, not fast, slow, like it didn't need speed, like it already knew it would touch me. I turned and ran, scraping my shoulder on the wall, kicking dirt behind me. The tunnel groaned, not from my steps, from something else moving inside it. I climbed the ladder 2 rungs at a time. The hatch slammed shut above me. I pushed. It didn't budge. Behind me, the voice laughed, not like Benjamin, like something that remembered how he laughed. "Don't go," it said. "We haven't finished the game." I pushed harder. Wood cracked, nails bent. The hatch burst open and I fell into the barn, gasping, the air above tasting like freedom. I rolled to my side, slammed the hatch closed and dragged a crate over it. The barn was silent again, but I wasn't. I sobbed, not for the first time since the war, but for the first time since I knew my son was no longer resting beneath that cross. He was calling, and something was answering with his voice. It rained the next day, not like a storm, not the kind of downpour that breaks things loose or sends birds running for shelter, but a steady, patient rain that seeped into the skin of the ground and turned every inch of earth into a mirror. I sat by the window most of the morning, watching the sky press down on the hills, watching the drops slide down the glass like they were trying to write something I couldn't read. And even inside the house, where it should have felt safe, the air tasted like dirt, wet, bitter, old. I didn't open the barn again. I couldn't. The hatch was still blocked, the crate still pressed tight against it. And even though no sound had come from below since the night before, I felt the echo of that voice in everything. The wood of the floor under my feet, the slow tick of the kitchen clock, the breath between my ribs. I had seen something down there. I had heard it call me Dad. And worse, part of me had wanted to answer. By late afternoon, the rain slowed. I walked outside because I couldn't stand the walls any longer, boots sinking in the mud with each step, the trees slick with moisture and the wind carrying that same faint smell, soil turned by hands that had no right to dig. I circled the barn once, checked the doors, still locked, still solid, though I didn't know what wood could stop the kind of thing that wore a boy's voice like a coat. Then I moved toward the back, toward the grave. It had always unsettled me, that patch of earth behind the barn, but today it looked different. The ground had shifted again, not just from the weight of the rain, but as if something beneath it had moved. The grass was flat, the soil darker, and there, around the cross, were footprints, small, bare, fresh. I froze. There were no other prints leading to them, no adult shoes, no animal tracks, nothing to explain how they got there, just a set of child's footprints, walking out of the grave. Not into it, out. They went several feet into the yard, then disappeared. I followed them, careful not to disturb the shape, my heart pounding slow and hard like it was being struck from the inside. The prints were detailed, too detailed. The arch of the foot, the curve of each toe, the impression of soft skin pressing down. They were Benjamin's size. I remembered washing his feet in the sink after he ran barefoot through the hayfields. I remembered the way he'd giggle when the water turned too cold. These were his feet. I kept walking, following the prints as they led toward the house. They stopped near the porch, right where the swing used to hang, and vanished. The mud beyond them was untouched, as if he'd stepped out of the earth, walked halfway home, and then, What? Evaporated? Been pulled back? Or worse, entered without leaving a mark? I turned toward the door. It was closed, locked. I opened it slowly. The house was still, too still. I stepped inside. The lamp on the table was off. I hadn't turned it off. The photograph on the mantel was face down. I hadn't touched it. I picked it up. It was the picture of Benjamin and Sarah on the porch, taken the week before I left for Europe. His eyes looked right at the camera. Hers didn't. She was looking at him, behind him. I looked closer. In the window behind their heads was a shape, tall, faceless, arms down, watching. I dropped the photo. The glass cracked. I turned slowly toward the hallway. At the end of it, Benjamin's door stood open. I stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of rain. His bed was made, but the window was open. And on the windowsill, mud. 2 perfect, small footprints, like someone had climbed in or out. The curtains swayed, though there was no wind. I stepped closer. Something lay on the floor beneath the bed. A drawing, crayons on brown paper. A figure, tall, black, with no eyes, standing over a child in a box. Beside it a figure bent low, a woman, and a third one, smaller, hidden behind the barn. Me, watching, forgotten. Below it, in Benjamin's handwriting, he said I could stay if I let him use my face. My knees gave out. I sat hard on the floor. The room darkened, though the sky was still light. I didn't move for a long time. When I finally stood, I folded the drawing and put it in my coat. I walked back outside. The rain had stopped completely. The prints in the yard were gone, washed clean or erased. And behind me, the porch swing creaked once, even though there was no swing anymore, only the sound and the cold breath of something remembering how it used to sit there. I didn't wait for another sign. I didn't sleep. I didn't tell anyone. I went straight to the barn before the sun had even started rising, the world still gray and wet and quiet, and I pulled the crate off the hatch with hands that no longer trembled, because fear had turned to something harder, something colder. I didn't light a lantern. I didn't need it. I knew the way now. My body had already memorized each rung of the ladder, each shift in the dirt wall, each smell that warned I was getting close to something that did not belong in any world I remembered. I climbed down, the wood creaking beneath me, the tunnel opening in the dark like a mouth that had waited long enough. I didn't stop when I reached the bottom. I walked. The ground was softer than before, as if something below had stirred. The walls pulsed faintly with dampness. The air moved, not from wind, but from breath. This time, there was no voice, no whisper, just silence, heavy, watching. I walked deeper, back toward the place where I had seen the shape of my son, the one that called me Dad in a tone not quite right, and I stopped where the tunnel widened. But there was nothing there now, no figure, no child, no eyes, just the dirt, disturbed, uneven, and a smell that lingered like skin long buried. I knelt, pressed my hand to the ground. It was warm. I went back up, back to the yard. The sun had begun to rise by then, casting long shadows across the field and the house and the grave. I didn't hesitate. I got the shovel and began to dig. I tore into the earth the way I had dug trenches in Belgium, fast and deep and without pause, the blade hitting rock and root and resistance. But I didn't stop. I dug past the soft top layer, past the settling soil, past the worms and the rot, until I struck the stone again, the one I had found before. I cleared it fully this time, wiping away the mud with my sleeve until the markings returned. The name was still there, Benjamin Grayson, but this time there was something else, a crack, running across the stone like a lightning bolt carved in silence. I wedged the shovel into the seam and pushed. The stone shifted, lifted. I pulled it aside, sweat soaking my shirt, breath burning in my throat, and looked down into the hole beneath. It was empty, no box, no body, just dirt, fresh, soft, like something had climbed out. I dropped to my knees and reached in, hands digging now with fingers instead of metal, scooping fistfuls of earth until I struck wood, but not a coffin, not even a box, just splinters, scattered and soaked, torn, shredded from the inside. I pulled one out. It had writing on it, Benjamin's name, written in marker, one letter missing, the rest smudged. I sat back, staring at the hole. Something had been here. Something had left. The ground began to pulse, not shake, pulse. A slow rhythmic beat from deep beneath the surface. I stood and turned. Across the yard, near the house, stood Jonathan, watching. He didn't speak. I walked toward him, the shovel still in my hand. He didn't move. "What did you bury here?" I asked. He looked past me. "I thought he was dead," he said. He wasn't. I know that now. "What did you see that night?" I asked. He swallowed hard. "I saw Sarah holding him," he said, "wrapped in blankets. He wasn't breathing. His eyes were open, but not seeing. And you helped her bury him anyway?" "She begged me," he said. "She said it was already too late." I stepped closer. "What did she mean?" He looked at the barn. "She said it had taken him." "What had?" He shook his head. "She never said." I turned. The barn stood quiet. I dropped the shovel. I walked back inside the house. In the living room on the table sat another drawing. Not one I'd seen before. Not one I remembered him making. A tunnel. A mouth. A man standing inside it. And beside the man, me. A smaller figure holding his hand. And beneath them, written in red crayon, "He let me go so you would come back." The wind had changed. I felt it that night, though nothing else had moved. The house remained still, the fields silent, the barn dark and shut tight like it hadn't been opened in years. But the wind had changed direction, and with it came a new weight in the air, a pressure not on the skin but inside the chest, like breath slowed down just enough to feel foreign. I knew I wouldn't sleep, not that I had in days, but this was different. It wasn't restlessness or fear or grief anymore. It was understanding, not complete, not clear, but whole enough to tell me the last piece of this thing wasn't buried in the yard, or written in a letter, or whispered in the dark. It was still walking, and it was waiting for me. I sat on the porch until the moon had climbed above the pines, full and yellow and too quiet. I held the last drawing in my lap, the one with the tunnel, the hand, the message scrawled in red. I read it again and again until the words no longer felt like language, but memory. "He let me go so you would come back." I thought about what that meant, what it required, what it offered. Benjamin was gone. That much was true, but not in the way graves tell the story. His body may have slept in that soil, but whatever soul or spark or essence he'd once held had been pulled loose, stretched thin, passed through something that didn't know how to let go. He had been taken, but not stolen, given, offered, and I began to understand that there had been a trade, that I had been part of it long before I ever left for war. I went inside and opened the cabinet where Sarah used to keep the family Bible. It was still there, wrapped in a cloth. Inside, tucked between the pages of Psalms, was a folded note, her handwriting, short, crooked, broken in places. It said, I couldn't stop it. "He knew your name. He said if I let him go, you'd come back. I just wanted one of you to survive. I'm sorry." I sat there for a long time, holding the paper, staring at the edge of the room where the light wouldn't reach. When I finally stood, I went to Benjamin's room. The window was closed now, the footprints on the sill gone, but the smell of rain lingered, and something else. Chalk, dust, like a classroom that hadn't been used in years. I opened the closet. It was empty, but the floorboard near the back creaked in a way that didn't match the others. I pulled it up. Beneath it, a bundle of pages, drawings like the others, dozens of them, all the same shape. A door, a spiral, a figure tall and thin and faceless, always standing beside a child. In some, the child held a balloon. In others, a shovel. In one, a crayon. Always the same phrase beneath, "He watches so I don't have to be alone." That was when I knew. My son hadn't been taken in a single night. It had started earlier, through whispers in the walls, in the voice under the house, in the cracks between moments where children imagine monsters but some of them aren't imagining. He'd made a deal, not because he was wicked, because he was a child, because something lonely had asked for his name, and he had given it. And when it came time to collect, Sarah had been the one left to decide what the price would be. She chose me, and I couldn't even blame her. I left before he could understand why. I died, at least on paper. She gave something in return, so one of us could be brought back. I lit the lantern one final time. I walked to the barn. The hatch opened before I touched it. The earth below was no longer cold. It welcomed. It remembered. I climbed down. The tunnel had changed. It wasn't stone or dirt anymore. It was memory. It was sound. I heard his laugh, not echoing but real. The way it had sounded on a swing on a summer day, when his hands gripped the rope and he asked me to push harder. I walked toward it. No fear, no hesitation. Just the kind of love that knows the world has sharp teeth and offers itself anyway. And when I reached the chamber, he was there. Not twisted, not wrong. Just Benjamin, whole, waiting. His arms reached out, and behind him the thing waited too, not with hunger, not with cruelty, just patience. It had worn his voice, now it wore mine. I took his hand, and I understood. The ground doesn't take, it receives, and sometimes it gives back, but not always what was taken, and never for free.